Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Queen Ealhswith, the remarkable Mercian princess who stood beside Alfred the Great during England's darkest hours and helped forge the foundations of the English nation. We'll softly explore her noble Mercian heritage, her strategic marriage to Prince Alfred, and her unwavering strength during the Viking invasions, from the terrifying flight to Athelney's marshes to the founding of Winchester's great abbey, all while witnessing the transformation of Anglo-Saxon England from divided kingdoms into a unified nation. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which part of Ealhswith's story you find most inspiring, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 9th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Ealhswith, later known as the beloved Lady of the English and wife of Alfred the Great, entered the world around the year 850 in the ancient kingdom of Mercia, during a time when England was not yet a single nation, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each fighting for survival against an increasingly dangerous enemy from across the sea. The land of her birth was Mercia, one of the most powerful and ancient of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, stretching across the heart of what we now call England. The name Mercia came from the Old English word mears, meaning border people, for the kingdom had been established along the frontiers between the various tribes that had settled Britain centuries earlier, after the Roman legions had withdrawn and left the island vulnerable to new settlers and invaders. These Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, had crossed the North Sea in the 5th and 6th centuries, establishing kingdoms that would eventually evolve into the medieval English nation. By the time of Ealhswith's birth in the mid-9th century, Mercia had known centuries of glory and power. The kingdom had been founded in the late 6th century and had grown steadily in strength and territory over the following generations. Under kings like Penda in the 7th century, Mercia had fought against the rival kingdom of Northumbria for supremacy in Britain. Under King Offa in the late 8th century, Mercia had reached the height of its power, dominating most of what is now England and maintaining diplomatic relations with the great Frankish Emperor Charlemagne on the continent. Offa was perhaps the most powerful English king before Alfred the Great. He had built the great earthwork dyke that still bears his name, Offa's Dyke, along the border with Wales, a massive construction project that demonstrated Mercia's wealth and organizational capacity. He had reformed the coinage, established new administrative systems, and had even negotiated a marriage alliance between his daughter and the King of Wessex. Though that particular marriage had ended in disaster, a story that would have profound implications for Ealhswith's own life, Offa's reign represented the peak of Mercian power and prestige. But the world into which Ealhswith was born was changing rapidly, and not for the better. The peaceful monasteries and prosperous towns that dotted the Mercian landscape were increasingly under threat from raiders who came in swift longships from the cold northern lands of Scandinavia. These were the Vikings, fierce warriors from Norway, Denmark and Sweden, who had begun raiding the British Isles in the late 8th century. The first recorded Viking raid on England had occurred in 793, when raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne on the Northumbrian coast, killing monks and stealing the church's treasures. That raid had sent shockwaves through Christian Europe and had marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Viking Age. In the decades following that first raid, the attacks had become more frequent and more devastating. Every summer, it seemed, Viking longships appeared off the coast, sailing up rivers to attack monasteries and towns before disappearing back to sea with their plunder. The monasteries were particularly vulnerable because they were wealthy, filled with gold and silver vessels, illuminated manuscripts with jeweled covers, and other treasures, but poorly defended, as the monks were men of peace who had little ability to resist armed warriors. But by the middle of the 9th century, the nature of the Viking threat was changing. What had started as seasonal raids for plunder was evolving into something far more threatening. Organized armies that came not just to steal and leave, but to conquer and settle. Viking leaders were beginning to see Britain not as a source of quick wealth, but as a place where they could establish permanent kingdoms of their own. Ealhswith was born into this turbulent world, into a family of considerable power and prestige within the Mercian kingdom. Her father was Ethelred Mukel, whose very name proclaimed his status. Ethelred meant noble counsel, suggesting a family tradition of serving as advisors to kings, while Musel was likely a family or territorial designation. He held the title of Ealdorman of the Gaini, one of the most important positions in the kingdom below royalty itself. The office of Ealdorman was central to Anglo-Saxon governance. In a time before centralized bureaucracies, when the king couldn't personally oversee every corner of his realm, Ealdormen served as the king's representatives in their regions. An ealdorman was responsible for administering justice in his territory, presiding over local courts where disputes were settled, and criminals were judged according to the laws of the land. He was responsible for maintaining order and peace, suppressing banditry and violence, and ensuring that the king's authority was respected throughout his jurisdiction. Perhaps most importantly in this age of Viking invasions, the ealdorman was responsible for military defense. When danger threatened, it was the ealdorman who summoned the local militia, called the fyrd, and led them into battle. Every free man owed military service to his lord and to his king, and the ealdorman was the one who organized and commanded these forces. In times of major war, when the king himself led the army, the ealdormen would bring their regional forces to join the royal host. But in local emergencies, the ealdorman was the supreme military commander in his territory. The Gaini, over whom Ethelred Musel held authority as ealdorman, were believed to be an ancient tribal group centered around the region of Gainsborough, in what is now Lincolnshire, in the eastern reaches of Mercia. This was fertile agricultural land, crossed by rivers that provided transportation and trade routes, dotted with villages and farms that produced the grain and livestock that fed the population. Gainsborough itself was an important regional centre, with a river crossing over the Trent that made it a natural gathering place for trade and administration. As ealdorman of this territory, Ethelred Musel would have maintained a household befitting his status. He would have had a great hall, a large timber building where he held court, entertained guests, and demonstrated his wealth and power through generous hospitality. Anglo-Saxon nobles were expected to be generous hosts, providing food and drink to their followers, giving gifts to loyal retainers, and maintaining an open-handed reputation for liberality. A lord who was stingy or mean was despised, while one who was generous in peace and brave in war was honoured and followed faithfully. The Great Hall would have been the centre of social and political life in the ealdorman's territory. It was where warriors gathered to feast and drink ale, where travelling merchants and craftsmen came to trade, where poets recited verses celebrating the deeds of heroes, and where the business of government was conducted. The hall itself would have been an impressive structure by the standards of the time, perhaps 60 or 80 feet long, built of massive oak timbers, with a thatched roof rising high above. Inside, There would have been a central hearth where a fire burned, providing warmth and light. The walls might have been hung with tapestries or painted decorations, and weapons, swords, spears, shields, would have been displayed to show the martial prowess of the household. Surrounding the great hall would have been other buildings, smaller halls or houses where retainers lived, workshops where craftsmen produced goods, stables for horses, storehouses for grain and other supplies, kitchens where food was prepared for the lord's table and for his many dependents. A nobleman like Ethelred Muckle would have had dozens or even hundreds of people dependent on him. Warriors who served in his retinue, craftsmen who worked on his estates, servants who maintained his household, slaves who did the hardest and most menial labor, and peasant farmers who worked the land and owed him rent and labor services. Into this world of Mercian nobility, Ealhswith was born, probably around the year 850, though the exact date of her birth was not recorded. In Anglo-Saxon society, birth dates were generally not considered as important as they are in modern times, and even for royal and noble children, the exact day and year of birth might go unrecorded. What mattered more were other milestones: coming of age, marriage, taking on adult responsibilities. But while Ealhswith's father gave her noble status and considerable wealth, it was her mother who gave her truly royal blood. Her mother was named Eadburh, and she was not merely the wife of an ealdorman, but a member of the Mercian royal family itself. Eadburh was descended from the kings of Mercia, and historical evidence suggests that she was likely a descendant of King Coenwulf, who had ruled Mercia from 796 to 821 with considerable success, maintaining Mercian independence and power during a period of challenge from Wessex and from Viking raiders. This royal heritage, through the maternal line, was enormously significant. In Anglo-Saxon England, descent could be traced through both the male and female lines, and royal blood on the mother's side could strengthen a person's claim to rule almost as much as royal blood on the father's side. For Ealhswith, this meant that while she was officially the daughter of an ealdorman, she was also a princess of the Mercian royal house through her mother. Any children she might have would carry this Mercian royal heritage, making them potential claimants to rule over Mercian territory. The name Eadburh itself was significant and carried considerable meaning in Mercian tradition. It was formed from two Old English elements, Ead, meaning prosperity or wealth, and Burh, meaning fortress or fortified place. Together, the name suggested prosperity fortress or wealthy stronghold, reflecting the Anglo-Saxon belief in the power of names to shape destiny. Names were carefully chosen, often to invoke particular qualities or to honor ancestors, and Eadburh was a name that spoke of strength, security, and abundance. Eadburh's reputation as a scholar was particularly remarkable for a woman of this period. While literacy was not unknown among noble women in Anglo-Saxon England, it was far from universal. Many noble women could not read or write, and their education focused on the practical skills needed to manage a large household, directing servants, overseeing food production and preservation, managing the production of textiles, and understanding herbal medicine and healing. But some noble women, particularly those in families with strong religious connections or intellectual traditions, did receive more extensive education that included learning to read religious texts in Old English, and sometimes even in Latin. The fact that Eadburh was known as a scholar suggests that she had received such an education, and that learning was valued in her family. This scholarly background would have important implications for her daughter Ealhswith's upbringing and education. A mother who valued learning would likely ensure that her daughter also received a good education, and we can imagine young Ealhswith being taught to read by her mother, learning psalms and prayers. perhaps even studying religious texts and developing the literacy that would serve her well in later life. Ealhswith's own name was equally meaningful and prophetic. It combined the Old English elements, Eal, meaning temple or shrine, and Swith, meaning strong or steadfast. Together, her name could be interpreted as strong in the temple or steadfast in faith, a name that suggested religious devotion and spiritual strength. Whether Ealhswith was given this name because her parents hoped she would be particularly pious, or whether it was simply a name that pleased them for its sound and meaning, it would prove remarkably appropriate for the life she would lead. Religion would play a central role in Ealhswith's life, from her support for her husband's efforts to promote Christian learning to her founding of religious houses and her own personal devotion to the church. Growing up in Mercia during the 850s meant growing up in a world of constant uncertainty and increasing danger. The great Mercian kingdom that had once dominated much of Britain was beginning to fracture under the pressure of Viking attacks and internal weaknesses. The Mercian royal family was experiencing instability, with various factions competing for influence and power. Different noble families jockeyed for position at court, formed alliances with one another, and sometimes engaged in outright conflicts. Meanwhile, the kingdom of Wessex to the south, once overshadowed by Mercian might, was beginning to emerge as a stronger power under a series of capable kings. King Ethelwulf of Wessex, who ruled from 839 to 858, had proven to be an effective defender against Viking attacks. He had won important victories, had maintained good relations with the church, and had established his family as the legitimate ruling dynasty of Wessex. When he died in 858, he was succeeded by his sons in turn, first Ethelbald, then Ethelbert, then Ethelred, and this stable succession contrasted sharply with the instability in Mercia, where the royal succession had become less certain. As a daughter of nobility, young Ealhswith would have received an education appropriate to her station, though what exactly this education entailed is something we have to piece together from what we know about noble women's education in this period more generally. While formal schooling as we understand it, attending a school building with other students, learning from professional teachers, was essentially non-existent in 9th century England, noble children did receive education, but it was provided at home by their parents, by household chaplains, or by visiting scholars and tutors. For a girl of Ealhswith's status, education would have had several components. First and most important were the domestic skills expected of a noble woman. She would have learned how to manage a great household, which was no small task. A noble household in Anglo-Saxon England was essentially a small community, with dozens or even hundreds of people dependent on the lord and lady for their livelihood. Managing such a household required understanding how to direct servants, how to organize labor, how to ensure that food supplies would last through the winter, how to oversee the production of textiles, from the shearing of sheep to the spinning of wool, to the weaving of cloth, to the sewing of garments, and how to maintain the stores of food, drink, and other supplies that the household needed. Young noble women were taught how to brew ale, which was the primary beverage in Anglo-Saxon England, since water was often unsafe to drink. They learned how to preserve food for winter, salting meat, drying fish, storing grain properly to prevent spoilage. They learned about herbs and their medicinal uses, as noble women were often expected to provide medical care for their households, treating injuries and illnesses with herbal remedies. They learned about household economy, how to manage resources, how to trade or barter for goods the household needed, how to ensure that the estate produced what was necessary for survival and prosperity. But Ealhswith's education almost certainly went beyond these purely practical matters. Given her mother's reputation as a scholar, it's highly likely that Ealhswith was taught to read, at least in Old English, and possibly in Latin as well. In Anglo-Saxon England, education in literacy was intimately connected with Christianity. The primary texts that literate people read were religious: the Bible, the Psalms, the lives of saints, books of prayers and liturgy. To be literate meant, in most cases, to be able to read religious texts. The Psalms were considered particularly important. These 150 poems from the Hebrew Bible were central to Christian worship and devotion. Monks chanted or sang the Psalms multiple times every day as part of their religious duties, and lay people who could read were encouraged to learn and recite them as well. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles who learned to read did so primarily in order to read and memorize the Psalms. Young Ealhswith would likely have been taught the Psalms, learning to read them in Latin, the language of the Church, or in Old English translation. She would also have received religious instruction more broadly. Anglo-Saxon England was a deeply Christian society, and religious knowledge was considered essential for everyone, not just for monks and priests. Ealhswith would have learned the basic prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, perhaps the Ave Maria. She would have learned about the Christian calendar, with its cycle of feast days and fasts, its celebration of Christmas and Easter, and the various saints' days that marked the passage of the year. She would have learned Christian moral teaching, about sin and virtue, about the expectation that Christians would be charitable to the poor, would be faithful in marriage, would attend church regularly, and would support the church through tithes and donations. As the daughter of a powerful ealdorman and a royal lady, Ealhswith would also have learned the social skills necessary for her position. She would have learned proper behavior at formal occasions, how to conduct herself at feasts, how to converse with guests, how to demonstrate the courtesy and dignity expected of a noble woman. She would have learned about the complex web of social relationships that bound Anglo-Saxon society together, who owed allegiance to whom, how alliances between families were formed and maintained, how disputes were resolved, how status and honor were demonstrated and protected. She might also have learned some of the arts that noblewomen were expected to master. Needlework was particularly important. The ability to embroider fine textiles was both a practical skill and a form of artistic expression. The Bayeux Tapestry, created in the 11th century, shows what Anglo-Saxon women were capable of producing. Intricate, detailed embroidery that told complex stories in visual form. While Ealhswith lived a century before the Bayeux Tapestry was created, noblewomen of her time were creating similar works, embroidering altar cloths and vestments for churches, creating decorative hangings for the walls of great halls, and producing fine clothing for themselves and their families. Music was another art that noble women might learn. Singing was particularly valued, as songs and hymns were important in both secular and religious contexts. At feasts in the Great Hall, professional poets called scops would sing songs celebrating the deeds of heroes and the history of the kingdom, often accompanying themselves on a stringed instrument like a harp or lyre. Noble women might also learn to sing religious songs and hymns, participating in the musical portions of church services. As Ealhswith grew from childhood into adolescence during the 850s and 860s, she would have become increasingly aware of the political currents swirling around her family and her kingdom. These were dangerous, uncertain times. The Viking threat was growing more serious with each passing year. What had begun as occasional raids was evolving into sustained campaigns of conquest. Viking armies were no longer just landing, grabbing what they could carry, and sailing away. Instead, they were establishing fortified winter camps in England, staying through multiple seasons, and systematically conquering territory. In 865, a year that would be remembered as marking a turning point in the Viking invasions, what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army arrived in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party, but a full invasion force, possibly numbering in the thousands, far larger than any Viking force that had come before. The army was led by legendary commanders whose names would echo through history and legend: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Guthrum. These Viking leaders were not mere raiders, but ambitious warlords who saw opportunities in the disunited kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. They came not just to plunder, but to conquer, to carve out kingdoms for themselves from the lands they could take. And they had the military skill, the organizational ability, and the ruthless determination to achieve their goals. The great army landed in East Anglia in the autumn of 865. The East Anglian kingdom, which covered what is now Norfolk and Suffolk, was one of the smaller and weaker Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Its king, Edmund, was a young man, probably in his 20s, who was pious and well-meaning, but not particularly skilled in warfare. When the Viking army arrived, Edmund tried to negotiate, providing horses to the Vikings in exchange for their promise to leave his kingdom in peace. The Vikings took the horses, which would prove useful for moving quickly across the English countryside, but they had no intention of leaving. Instead, they spent the winter of 865-866 in East Anglia, living off the land, extorting supplies from the terrorized population, and preparing for their next move. Then, in the spring of 866, they moved north into Northumbria. The kingdom of Northumbria, which stretched from the Humber River in the south to the Scottish border in the north, had once been one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Northumbria had been a centre of learning and culture, home to great monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow, producing scholars like the Venerable Bede, who had written the first history of the English people. But by the mid-9th century, Northumbria had fallen into decline. The kingdom was weakened by internal divisions, with different noble factions fighting for control. When the Viking army arrived in Northumbria in 866, the kingdom was divided between two rival kings, Osbert and Ella, who were more interested in fighting each other than in uniting against the external threat. The Vikings took advantage of this division. On November 1st, 866, they captured York, the ancient Roman city that was the capital of Northumbria. York was an important prize, a walled city that could serve as a secure base, a trading centre that controlled routes into Scotland and across to the Irish Sea, and a symbolic victory that demonstrated the Vikings' power. The capture of York sent shockwaves through Anglo-Saxon England. If a great city like York could fall, nowhere was safe. The rival Northumbrian kings finally put aside their differences and united their forces to try to recapture York. In March 867, they attacked the city, managing to break through the walls and engage the Viking defenders in street fighting within the city itself. But the Vikings were experienced warriors, skilled at exactly this kind of close-quarters urban combat, and they defeated the Northumbrian attack decisively. Both King Osbert and King Ella were killed in the battle, and with them died the last hopes of Northumbrian independence. According to Viking saga tradition, King Ella was captured alive and was subjected to a particularly gruesome execution known as the Blood Eagle, supposedly in revenge for his earlier killing of the legendary Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok, who was said to be the father of Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan. Whether this story is true, exaggerated, or entirely legendary is debated by historians, but what's certain is that Ella died, and that the Viking victory was complete. The Vikings installed a puppet king in York, and effectively controlled Northumbria from that point forward. With Northumbria under their control, the great army turned its attention to Mercia, Ealhswith's homeland. In 867-868, the Vikings moved into eastern Mercia and established themselves at Nottingham, an important fortified town on the River Trent. Nottingham was strategically valuable because it controlled river crossings and trade routes, and the Vikings fortified it further, making it a secure base for operations throughout the region. The Mercian king at this time was Burgred, who had married Ealhswith, the daughter of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. This marriage, which had taken place years earlier, had been intended to create an alliance between Mercia and Wessex, binding the two kingdoms together against common threats. Now, with the Viking army occupying Nottingham and threatening to conquer all of Mercia, that alliance would be put to the test. King Burgred found himself in an extremely difficult position. The Viking army at Nottingham was too powerful for him to attack with Mercian forces alone. But if he didn't act, the Vikings would use Nottingham as a base to conquer more and more of his kingdom. He needed help, and the natural source of that help was Wessex, his allies to the south through his marriage to a West Saxon princess. Burgred sent urgent messages south to Wessex, appealing to his brothers-in-law King Ethelred of Wessex and Prince Alfred for military assistance. The message would have travelled quickly, carried by mounted messengers riding day and night to cover the distance from Nottingham to wherever the West Saxon royal court happened to be at the time. The request for help would have been phrased in terms of family obligation. Burgred was married to their sister, making them family, and family helped family in times of crisis, but also in terms of strategic necessity. If Mercia fell to the Vikings, Wessex would be next. Better to fight the Vikings in Mercia with Mercian allies than to wait and fight them alone in Wessex. King Ethelred and Prince Alfred responded to Burgred's appeal, gathering a West Saxon army and marching north to Mercia. This was Alfred's first major campaign outside of Wessex, and it would prove to be significant not just militarily, but personally. The West Saxon army met up with Burgred's Mercian forces, and together they marched to Nottingham and laid siege to the Viking stronghold. The siege of Nottingham in the autumn of 868 was a tense standoff. The combined Anglo-Saxon forces surrounded the town, cutting off supplies and trying to starve out the Viking defenders. But the Vikings were secure behind their fortifications, and they had provisions enough to withstand a siege. The Anglo-Saxons, meanwhile, couldn't maintain a siege indefinitely. Their army was a militia force, farmers and craftsmen who had been called up for military service, but who needed to return to their homes and livelihoods. As autumn turned toward winter, the pressure to reach some kind of resolution grew stronger. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxon kings decided that a direct assault on the fortifications would cost too many lives. Instead, they negotiated a peace with the Vikings. The exact terms of this peace aren't recorded, but it seems to have involved the Vikings agreeing to leave Mercia, at least temporarily, in exchange for being allowed to depart unmolested. This might seem like a weak response, but it was actually fairly typical of how Anglo-Saxon kings dealt with Viking forces that were too strong to defeat easily. By negotiating and bribing the Vikings to leave, they could avoid the casualties of a battle while still preserving their kingdom's independence. It was during this siege of Nottingham in 868 that Prince Alfred of Wessex met the young Mercian noblewoman, Ealhswith. The circumstances of their first meeting are lost to history. No chronicler thought to record the romantic or social details of how a prince and a noblewoman first encountered each other. But we can reconstruct the probable scenario based on what we know about military campaigns and noble society in this period. The military camp outside Nottingham would have been a complex, bustling place. It wasn't just warriors with their weapons. The camp would also have included numerous non-combatants, servants who took care of the nobles' personal needs, cooks who prepared food for the army, craftsmen who repaired weapons and equipment, priests who conducted religious services and heard confessions, and women, the wives and daughters of nobles, who often accompanied their menfolk on campaign, particularly during sieges that might last weeks or months. Ealhswith's father, Ealdorman Ethelred Muckle, was a powerful lord in eastern Mercia, and his territory included the region around Gainsborough, not far from Nottingham. It would have been natural and expected for him to join King Burgred's forces with his own retainers when the king called for help against the Vikings. And if Ethelred Muckle was at Nottingham with the Mercian army, it's quite possible, even likely, that his family, including his daughter Ealhswith, would have been there as well, probably staying at some secure location near, but not in the camp itself. The leaders of the two armies, King Burgred of Mercia, King Ethelred of Wessex, Prince Alfred, would have held regular councils of war to discuss strategy. These councils would have included the most important nobles from both kingdoms, including ealdormen like Ethelred Muckle. At these gatherings, and at the feasts and religious services that would have marked important occasions during the siege, the elite of both kingdoms would have mingled, creating opportunities for personal connections to be made. Alfred, who was probably around 19 years old at this time, was already showing the qualities that would make him remarkable. According to his biographer Asser, Alfred had been his father's favourite son, had travelled to Rome as a child where he had been blessed by the Pope, and had received an education that was unusual for a prince. Most importantly, Alfred had already proven himself in battle. In the years before the Nottingham campaign, Wessex had been fighting its own wars against Viking raiders, and Alfred had distinguished himself in combat, showing both courage and tactical skill. Ealhswith would have been perhaps 17 or 18 years old, around the typical age for noble women to marry. She was beautiful enough to catch a prince's eye, though beauty is subjective and we have no contemporary descriptions of her appearance, but more importantly, she was noble enough to be a suitable match. She was the daughter of a powerful ealdorman, which made her a member of the high nobility, if not quite of royal rank. But through her mother Eadbert, she had royal Mercian blood, which elevated her status considerably. Whether the attraction between Alfred and Ealhswith was immediate or developed over time, whether it was primarily romantic or primarily political, we cannot know. What we do know is that marriage negotiations began. Alfred was not King of Wessex. That position belonged to his older brother Ethelred, but he was the king's brother and heir presumptive. Though Ethelred had sons of his own, they were still children. And Anglo-Saxon succession practices meant that an adult brother could inherit the throne instead of a child, especially in wartime when experienced leadership was crucial. For Wessex, a marriage between Alfred and a Mercian noblewoman made excellent political sense. It would strengthen the alliance between the two kingdoms at a time when cooperation was essential for survival against the Viking threat. It would give Alfred personal connections within Mercia, family ties that could be leveraged for diplomatic and political purposes. And if Alfred did eventually become king, having a wife with Mercian royal heritage could help legitimize any West Saxon claims to authority over Mercia. For Mercia, and specifically for Ealhswith's family, the match was equally advantageous. Although Alfred was not yet king, he was young, capable, and had excellent prospects. By marrying their daughter to Alfred, Ealhswith's family would forge a direct connection to the West Saxon royal house. More importantly, through Ealhswith's mother's royal Mercian lineage, any children of this marriage would carry both West Saxon and Mercian royal blood. This dual heritage could give them claims to rule over both kingdoms, potentially uniting Wessex and Mercia under a single dynasty, an outcome that would benefit both kingdoms in their struggle against the Vikings. The negotiations for such a marriage would have been complex and would have involved discussions of many practical matters. There was the matter of the dowry, the property and money that Ealhswith's family would provide as part of the marriage agreement. There was the matter of the mourning gift, the property that Alfred would grant to Ealhswith after the wedding night, which would become her personal property to control and dispose of as she wished. There were discussions of where the couple would live, what household they would maintain, what resources would be provided for their support, and what role Ealhswith would play as a West Saxon princess. These negotiations would have taken time, possibly weeks or even months. Messages would have been sent back and forth between the two families, discussing terms, making counteroffers, consulting with advisors and family members. Eventually, however, agreement was reached. The marriage would go forward, uniting Prince Alfred of Wessex with the noble Mercian lady Ealhswith, daughter of Ealdorman Ethelred Muckle, and the royal lady Eadburh. The wedding ceremony itself took place at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, in the heart of the territory controlled by Ealhswith's family. The choice of Gainsborough as the wedding location was significant. It was a statement that this was not just a West Saxon affair, but a union that honoured Ealhswith's Mercian heritage. The location was also practical, as Gainsborough was a major centre in the region, with facilities sufficient to host the large gathering that would attend such an important wedding. Preparations for the wedding would have begun weeks in advance. In Anglo-Saxon England, weddings among the nobility were not simple affairs, but major social and political events that could last for days. The bride's family would have been responsible for much of the organisation and expense, and Ethelred Muckle, as a wealthy and powerful ealdorman, would have spared no expense to ensure that his daughter's wedding was memorable and demonstrated his family's status and hospitality. The great hall at Gainsborough would have been cleaned and decorated for the occasion. Fresh rushes would have been laid on the floor, mixed with sweet-smelling herbs to mask odours and add fragrance. The walls might have been hung with tapestries or painted cloths, displaying scenes from history or legend, or perhaps just decorative patterns in bright colours. Benches and tables would have been arranged to accommodate the many guests, with places of honour reserved for the most important attendees, the bride and groom, their immediate families, and the highest-ranking nobles and clergy present. The wedding feast would have required enormous quantities of food and drink. Cattle, pigs, and sheep would have been slaughtered and prepared for roasting. Ovens would have been working day and night to produce the bread that was a staple at every meal. Vegetables from the estate's gardens would have been prepared. Onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, and whatever else was in season in the autumn of 868. Fish might have been served as well, particularly if the wedding took place on or near a day when meat was forbidden by church rules. Eggs, cheese, and butter would have been needed in large quantities for various dishes. The brewing of ale would have been a major undertaking. Ale was the standard drink in Anglo-Saxon England, consumed by everyone from nobles to peasants. It was safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated, and it provided calories and nutrition, as well as a mild alcoholic content that made social occasions more convivial. Brewing enough ale for a multi-day feast with hundreds of guests would have required weeks of work by skilled brewers, using grain from the estate stores and the special knowledge passed down through generations about how to brew consistently good ale. Wine might also have been served, though it was much rarer and more expensive than ale. Wine had to be imported from the continent, coming from Francia or even from as far south as Italy. and it was a luxury item reserved for the most important occasions and the most honoured guests. If wine was served at Ealhswith's wedding, and given the importance of the occasion and the wealth of both families, it probably was. It would have been a sign of the great honour being shown to the guests and the significance of the alliance being celebrated. The wedding ceremony itself would have combined Christian religious rites with older Anglo-Saxon customs. The Church had been working for centuries to Christianize marriage practices, but many traditional customs persisted alongside the Christian rituals. The ceremony would probably have begun with the formal transfer of the bride from her family to the groom, a custom that dated back to pagan times but had been given Christian meaning. Ealhswith's father would have formally given his daughter to Alfred, placing her hand in Alfred's hand in a gesture that symbolized the transfer of guardianship and protection from father to husband. The religious portion of the ceremony would have taken place in a church, probably the most important church in Gainsborough. A priest would have presided, conducting the service according to the rites of the Anglo-Saxon Church. There would have been prayers for the couple's happiness and prosperity, for their fertility and the blessing of children, for their faithfulness to each other and to God. Blessings would have been pronounced over them, calling on God to protect them and guide them through their married life together. The bride and groom would have exchanged vows, though the exact form of Anglo-Saxon wedding vows is not recorded in detail in surviving sources. They would have pledged faithfulness to each other, promised to honour and support one another, and committed themselves to the marriage bond that the Church taught was sacred and indissoluble. Alfred would have given Ealhswith the mourning gift, the property that would become hers after the consummation of the marriage, and this gift would have been formally witnessed and recorded. Then would have come the Mass, the central act of Christian worship, during which the Eucharist would be celebrated and the couple would receive communion together for the first time as husband and wife. This was deeply significant in medieval Christian theology. By taking communion together, the couple were joining themselves not just to each other, but to Christ and to the Church, making their union not merely a social contract, but a spiritual reality blessed by God. After the religious ceremonies came the secular celebrations, the feasting, the drinking, the entertainment, and the socializing that marked any major gathering of the nobility. The great hall would have been filled with nobles from both Mercia and Wessex, creating an opportunity for political networking and alliance building that was as important as the wedding itself. Lords who might rarely see each other would have this chance to meet face to face, to discuss politics and strategy, to negotiate deals and settle disputes, to arrange marriages for their own children, and to strengthen the bonds between families and kingdoms. The feast would have been elaborate by the standards of the time. Whole oxen and pigs would have been roasted over open fires outside the hall, their meat carved and brought to the tables still sizzling hot. Roasted fowl, geese, ducks, chickens, perhaps even swans if the wedding was especially grand, would have been served. Fish dishes, both freshwater fish from local rivers and salted or dried ocean fish brought from the coast, would have provided variety. Vegetable dishes, porridges made from grain, bread in various forms from coarse dark bread to finer white bread for the high-status guests, butter, cheese, and numerous other dishes would have filled the tables. The entertainment would have been an important part of the celebration. Professional poets and musicians, called scops in Anglo-Saxon, would have performed, reciting poems celebrating the deeds of heroes, singing songs of love and battle, and perhaps composing new verses specifically for the occasion, celebrating the union of Alfred and Ealhswith. These poets were skilled performers who could recite from memory thousands of lines of poetry, often accompanying themselves on stringed instruments like the harp or lyre. There might also have been other entertainments: jugglers, acrobats, trained animals performing tricks, contests of strength or skill among the warriors, wrestling matches and other athletic competitions were common forms of entertainment at feasts, allowing warriors to demonstrate their prowess in a non-lethal context. The celebration would have included dancing as well, though what Anglo-Saxon dancing looked like is not well documented in surviving sources. It was probably fairly simple compared to the elaborate court dances of later centuries, but it would have provided an opportunity for social interaction and celebration. Throughout the feast, ale and wine would have flowed freely. Drinking was an important social activity in Anglo-Saxon culture, and the ability to drink generously while maintaining one's composure was considered a mark of good character. The lord of the feast, in this case Ealhswith's father, would have proposed toast to the bride and groom, to the alliance between Wessex and Mercia, to King Burgred and King Ethelred, to victory over the Vikings, and to numerous other causes worth celebrating. Guests would have responded with their own toasts, and as the evening wore on and the ale and wine took effect, the gathering would have become progressively more boisterous and cheerful. But according to the account of Asser, Alfred's biographer, something unusual and troubling happened on this joyous occasion. During the wedding festivities, possibly during the feast itself, or perhaps earlier in the day during the ceremony, Alfred was struck by a sudden illness. Asser describes this as a mysterious ailment that caused Alfred considerable pain and suffering. The illness came upon him suddenly and without warning, disrupting what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. This illness would plague Alfred throughout his life, causing him periodic bouts of suffering. Asser describes it as a painful condition, but doesn't provide enough detail for modern doctors to make a confident diagnosis. Over the centuries, historians and medical researchers have speculated endlessly about what might have been wrong with Alfred. Some have suggested Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory condition of the digestive system that can cause severe abdominal pain, diarrhea, and other symptoms. Others have proposed hemorrhoids, which can be extremely painful. Still others have suggested that Alfred's condition might have been at least partly psychosomatic, that is, physical symptoms caused or worsened by psychological stress and anxiety. This last theory is actually fairly plausible. Alfred was a deeply religious man who took his responsibilities very seriously. He was also, from what we can tell from Asser's biography, someone who worried constantly about whether he was doing enough, whether he was living up to his obligations, whether he was serving God faithfully. In Asser's account, Alfred prayed constantly for God to give him some affliction that would test his faith and keep him humble, but not a condition so visible that it would cause people to despise him. According to Asser, Alfred received exactly what he prayed for, an invisible illness that caused him great suffering, but didn't prevent him from fulfilling his duties. Whether we believe Asser's theological interpretation or not, the fact remains that Alfred suffered from some chronic condition that caused him periodic severe pain, and the fact that it struck him on his wedding day, a day that should have been purely joyful, but that must also have been stressful, given the political implications of the marriage and the responsibilities Alfred was taking on, suggests that stress might indeed have played a role in triggering his symptoms. For Ealhswith, beginning her married life with a husband who was struck by mysterious illness on their wedding day must have been deeply concerning. Here was this young prince whom she was binding her life to, this man who would be her companion and protector, the father of her children, suddenly writhing in pain for no apparent reason. What did this mean for their future together? Would he be able to fulfill his duties as a husband, as a warrior, as a leader? Would this mysterious illness prevent him from fathering children, or from living to old age? Despite Alfred's illness, the wedding proceeded, and the marriage was consummated. The consummation of the marriage was not just a private matter between bride and groom, but had legal and social significance. In Anglo-Saxon law, a marriage was not considered fully valid until it had been consummated. The morning after the wedding night, Alfred would have formally given Ealhswith the morning gift, the property that now became legally hers to control. This might have included land, money, jewellery, or other valuable goods, and it represented Ealhswith's economic security, property that would remain hers even if Alfred died, property that she could use to support herself, and that she could pass on to her children. After the wedding celebrations concluded, which might have lasted for 3 days or even longer, Ealhswith left her Mercian homeland to travel south to Wessex with her new husband. This departure from her family and everything familiar must have been bittersweet. She was embarking on a new life, taking on a new identity as a West Saxon princess, but she was leaving behind her parents, her siblings if she had any, the servants and companions she had known since childhood, the landscape and places that were familiar to her, and the Mercian identity that had defined her for the first 18 years of her life. The journey from Gainsborough to Wessex would have taken several days, possibly a week or more, depending on the route taken and the conditions of travel. The party would have travelled on horseback, with wagons carrying Ealhswith's possessions, her clothes and jewellery, her personal items, perhaps religious books or other treasured objects, and the goods that formed part of her dowry. They would have followed Roman roads where possible, as these were still the best routes for long-distance travel, even though they hadn't been maintained properly for centuries and were in various states of decay. The journey would have taken them through the English countryside, past villages and farms, through forests and across rivers. They would have stopped each night at royal estates or at the homes of nobles who owed hospitality to the king's brother, sleeping in whatever accommodation was available and eating whatever food the local lord could provide. It would have been Ealhswith's first extended time alone with her new husband, their first opportunity to really get to know each other beyond the formal courtship that had led to their marriage. When they finally reached Wessex, Ealhswith found herself in a kingdom that was similar to Mercia in many ways, but different in others. The landscape was different. Wessex stretched from the Thames Valley in the north to the English Channel in the south, encompassing diverse terrain including the chalk downlands, river valleys and coastal plains. The people spoke the same Old English language that Ealhswith had grown up speaking, but with a West Saxon accent and dialect that differed slightly from the Mercian form she was used to. More significantly for Ealhswith, she found herself in a kingdom with very different traditions regarding the role of the king's wife. In Mercia, as in most Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, queens could be powerful and prominent figures. They witnessed charters, held their own land and resources, played public roles in religious and political life, and were honoured with the title of queen. But Wessex was different, and the reason for this difference had its roots in a scandal from the previous century. The story, as told by Asser and preserved in other sources, went back to the late 8th century. At that time, a Mercian princess named Eadburh, the same name, ironically, as Ealhswith's mother, had been married to King Beorhtric of Wessex. This marriage had been arranged by Eadburh's father, the powerful King Offa of Mercia, as a way of extending Mercian influence into Wessex. But according to the stories that were told about her, Eadburh had been a terrible queen. She was said to have been ambitious, manipulative, and ruthless. She supposedly used her influence over her husband to advance her own supporters and to destroy anyone she saw as a threat or an enemy. Most damningly, she was accused of poisoning people who opposed her. The story told that she would identify someone at court who was a problem for her, prepare poison, and administer it to them, causing their death. This went on for some time, with various courtiers dying mysteriously, until finally Eadbert made a fatal mistake. According to the legend, Eadbert attempted to poison one of her enemies at court, but somehow the poison ended up being consumed by her husband, King Bortrick, instead. Whether this was an accident, she got confused about which cup contained the poison, or whether it was deliberate because Bortrick had finally discovered what she was doing, and she needed to silence him. The story doesn't say. Either way, King Bortrick died from the poison in 802. Eadbert fled Wessex after her husband's death, taking treasure with her, and eventually made her way to the court of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor. There, according to one version of the story, Charlemagne offered her a choice. She could marry him or his son. Eadbert replied that she would choose the son because he was younger. Charlemagne told her that if she had chosen him, she could have had his son, but since she chose the son, she would have neither. Instead, Charlemagne made her abbess of a monastery, but she was eventually expelled from that position as well for immoral behavior, and she died in poverty and disgrace somewhere in Italy. Whether this story is true, exaggerated, or largely invented is impossible to say with certainty. What matters is that the people of Wessex believed it, or at least believed enough of it to have very negative feelings about powerful queens. King Bortrick's successor, Ecgbert, who was Alfred's grandfather, seems to have instituted the policy that the king's wife would not be called queen, would not sit beside the king publicly, and would not be given the formal powers and prerogatives that queens enjoyed in other kingdoms. This policy had continued through subsequent reigns. Asser records that King Alfred himself explained this tradition to him, telling the story of the wicked Queen Eadbert and how her actions had brought the title of queen into such disrepute in Wessex that subsequent kings' wives were denied that honour. Whether Alfred himself believed this was the right policy, or was simply following the established tradition, is unclear. What's certain is that the policy was enforced during his reign, and this meant that Ealhswith, despite being married to a prince who would later become king, would never officially hold the title of queen. This must have been difficult for Ealhswith to accept and understand. In her homeland of Mercia, she would have expected that if she married a king or a prince who became king, she would be queen, with all the honour and authority that entailed. Now she was being told that West Saxon tradition denied her this. She would be the king's wife, she would be honoured as such, but she would not be queen. She would not witness official documents, would not sit beside her husband in public ceremonies, would not exercise the kind of overt political power that queens in other kingdoms wielded. However, the absence of the formal title of queen didn't necessarily mean complete absence of influence or power. Even without the title, Ealhswith would still have been the wife of an important prince, and later of the king himself. She would still have been responsible for managing the royal household, still have been the mother of the royal children, still have been able to advise her husband privately, even if she couldn't do so publicly. And as we'll see, later in life after Alfred's death, when she became the king's mother rather than the king's wife, Ealhswith would be able to take on a more public role without violating the West Saxon taboo against queenship. For now though, in the early days of her marriage in 868, Ealhswith had to adjust to her new life as a West Saxon princess. She had to learn the customs and expectations of her new home, had to establish her position within the royal household, had to build relationships with the important nobles and ladies of the court, and had to navigate the complex social and political world of the West Saxon elite. And she had to do all this while supporting a husband who was not just a prince, but also a military commander in a kingdom that was increasingly under threat from Viking attacks. The first few years of Ealhswith and Alfred's marriage coincided with a period of relative calm in the Viking wars, but it was a deceptive calm. The great heathen army had left Nottingham and returned to York, which they were using as their primary base in England. From there, they raided into Scotland and made expeditions into other parts of northern England, consolidating their control over what had been the kingdom of Northumbria. But they weren't attacking Wessex directly, which allowed Alfred and Ealhswith to establish their married life without immediate crisis. During this period, Ealhswith would have been setting up her household, establishing herself in the role of a royal wife. She would have had her own servants and attendants, women who served her personally and helped with the daily tasks of managing her wardrobe, her jewelry, her personal quarters, and her daily routine. She would have had a chamberlain or steward manage the financial and administrative aspects of her household, and she would have begun building the network of relationships and loyalties that any successful noblewoman needed. Friendships with other noble ladies, patron-client relationships with lesser nobles who sought her favor, and connections with clergy who could provide spiritual guidance and who depended on noble patronage for their churches and monasteries. Most importantly, Ealhswith began the work of producing heirs for the West Saxon royal house. In royal and noble marriages in Anglo-Saxon England, one of the primary purposes of marriage was to produce legitimate children who could inherit property, titles, and positions. For a royal marriage specifically, producing sons who could succeed to the throne was absolutely crucial. A king who died without a son risked throwing the kingdom into succession crisis, with various relatives and factions competing for power. A king who died with several sons ensured that the succession would remain within his direct line, even if those sons might compete with each other. Ealhswith's first child was born around 870, probably within a year or two of her marriage to Alfred. This first child was a daughter, and they named her Ethelfled. The name was carefully chosen, as Anglo-Saxon names always were. Ethelfled combined Ethel, meaning noble, with fled, meaning beauty or glory. The name proclaimed that this was a noble and beautiful child, a daughter worthy of her royal heritage. The birth of a first child, especially a daughter, might seem like a disappointment compared to the birth of a son, but this wasn't necessarily the case in Anglo-Saxon England. Daughters were valuable in their own right, not just as potential mothers of grandsons, but as tools of diplomacy and alliance building. A royal daughter could be married to a foreign king or to an important noble, creating family ties that bound kingdoms and families together. The fact that Ethelfled was a girl didn't mean she was unwanted or unimportant. She was the first child, the eldest, and she would carry a special status throughout her life because of that. No one, of course, could have predicted that this infant girl, born in 870, during some of the darkest days of the Viking invasions, would grow up to become one of the most remarkable women in English history. A military commander who would lead armies, build fortresses, and rule a kingdom. For now, she was simply a baby, the firstborn child of Alfred and Ealhswith, a symbol of their union and a sign of hope for the future. About a year later, around 871 or 872, Ealhswith gave birth to a second daughter, Ethelgifu. This name meant noble gift, suggesting that she was seen as a precious gift from God. From early in her life, it seems to have been understood that Ethelgifu would be dedicated to religious life. Whether this was because she was sickly or disabled in some way, or whether it was simply a pious decision by her parents to dedicate one child to God's service, we don't know. But unlike her elder sister Ethelfled, who would eventually marry and have children, Ethelgifu's path was set toward the church from an early age. Then, sometime around 874 or 875, came the birth that every royal family hoped for, a son. They named him Edward. which was actually a somewhat unusual choice for the West Saxon royal family. Most West Saxon princes had names like Ethelred, Ethelwulf, Ethelstan, or other names beginning with the element Ethel, noble, or Ed, prosperity, wealth. Edward, meaning wealthy guardian, or protector of riches, was different. Some historians have suggested that Alfred chose this name to honour Ealhswith's family, specifically her mother Eadburh, with Edward being a masculine form that echoed the first element of Eadburh's name. If this is true, it was a graceful gesture that acknowledged Ealhswith's Mercian heritage and the importance of her royal bloodline. Edward would carry the blood of both West Saxon and Mercian kings, and his name reflected that dual heritage. Another daughter followed around 877, named Ealhswith or Elfrida. This name meant elf strength, reflecting the Anglo-Saxon belief in supernatural beings called elves, who inhabited the world alongside humans. Elves in Anglo-Saxon belief weren't the tiny, whimsical creatures of later folklore, but powerful supernatural beings who could be either helpful or harmful to humans. To name a child Elf Strength was to invoke the power and protection of these beings, hoping they would bless the child with strength and good fortune. Finally, there was a youngest son, Ethelred, born around 880. His name meant noble guardian, continuing the family tradition of names beginning with the Ethel element. Unlike his brother Edward, who was clearly being groomed for kingship, Ethelred received a more scholarly education. He learned Latin extensively, unusual for a prince who wasn't destined for the church, and was apparently intended to serve as a learned advisor and administrator, rather than as a military commander. That all 5 of these children survived to adulthood was remarkable by the standards of 9th century England, where infant mortality was terribly high. Modern estimates suggest that in medieval England, as many as 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday, succumbing to infectious diseases, accidents, malnutrition, or any of the countless dangers that threatened young children in an age before modern medicine and sanitation. That Ealhswith successfully raised 5 children to adulthood speaks to the quality of care they received, the relative privilege of their position, and perhaps also to simple good fortune. But there may have been other children who didn't survive. In royal families of this period, infant deaths often went unrecorded in the chronicles and documents that have come down to us. Chroniclers tended to mention only children who lived long enough to be significant, who married, who held important positions, who played roles in the politics and warfare of the day. A baby who died in infancy or early childhood might not be mentioned at all in the surviving sources, so it's quite possible that Ealhswith gave birth to other children who died young, and whose names and very existence have been lost to history. The early years of Alfred and Ealhswith's marriage, while blessed with healthy children, were increasingly overshadowed by the growing Viking threat. The brief period of relative peace after the siege of Nottingham didn't last long. In 870, the great heathen army attacked East Anglia again, and this time they didn't just raid, they conquered. King Edmund of East Anglia, the young king who had tried to buy peace with the Vikings 2 years earlier, died fighting against them. According to tradition, Edmund was captured, tortured, and killed for refusing to renounce his Christian faith, making him a martyr. Whether the details of the story are accurate or not, Edmund was dead, and East Anglia was now under Viking control. With Northumbria and East Anglia conquered and Mercia badly weakened, Wessex stood alone as the only major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still independent. The Vikings knew this, and in 871 they turned their full attention to conquering Wessex and finishing what they had started. That year, 871, would be remembered as one of the most terrible in West Saxon history, a year of almost constant warfare, of repeated battles, of desperate struggles for survival. The year began with a Viking invasion force arriving in Wessex, establishing a base at Reading on the River Thames. Reading was a strategically valuable location because it controlled river access deep into the heart of Wessex, and the Vikings fortified it heavily, building ramparts and ditches to protect their camp. King Ethelred and his brother Alfred gathered a West Saxon army and attacked the Viking position at Reading, but the attack failed. The Vikings were too well entrenched, and the West Saxons were forced to retreat with heavy losses. A few days later, the two armies met again at a place called Ashdown on the Berkshire Downs. This battle became one of the most famous in Alfred's early life. According to the story told by Asser, the two sides drew up their battle lines on the slopes of the downs, with the Vikings holding the high ground. King Ethelred was in his tent praying before the battle, refusing to come out until the religious service was finished. Meanwhile, the Vikings began to advance down the hill toward the West Saxon position. Alfred, seeing that the Vikings were attacking and that his brother was still at prayer, made a decision. Rather than wait for his brother and risk being overwhelmed, Alfred ordered the West Saxon forces to advance immediately, charging uphill to meet the Viking attack. It was a brave but risky decision. Attacking uphill against a prepared enemy was extremely difficult, but Alfred led from the front, and his men followed him. According to Asser, there was a single thorn tree on the hillside that became the focal point of the battle, with men fighting desperately around this landmark. The battle raged for hours. King Ethelred eventually emerged from his prayers and joined the fight. Finally, the West Saxon forces managed to break the Viking shield wall, and the Vikings fled, pursued by Alfred's forces. Many Vikings were killed in the rout, including one of their kings. It was a tremendous victory, the first major West Saxon success against the great heathen army, and it established Alfred's reputation as a bold and capable military commander. But the victory at Ashdown didn't end the war. Just 2 weeks later, the armies fought again at a place called Basing, and this time the Vikings won. Another battle followed at a place the sources call Meritun, with an indecisive outcome. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and neither could claim clear victory. The fighting continued throughout the winter and into the spring of 871, with multiple battles and skirmishes. Wessex was hemorrhaging men, losing warriors faster than they could be replaced. Then, in the spring of 871, King Ethelred died. He may have died from wounds received in battle, or he may have died from disease. The sources aren't clear. He was probably in his 20s, dying after only 5 years as king, leaving behind a widow and 2 young sons. According to Anglo-Saxon tradition, the crown should have passed to one of Ethelred's sons when they came of age, but they were still children, probably no more than 5 or 6 years old at most. Wessex was in the middle of an existential war for survival. The kingdom needed an experienced adult leader, not a child king. And so, in April 871, Alfred became king of Wessex. He was only about 22 years old, and he inherited a kingdom that was on the brink of collapse, facing an enemy that had already conquered most of England. For Ealhswith, still in her early 20s herself, this sudden elevation from being a prince's wife to being a king's wife, even if she couldn't be called queen, must have been both exhilarating and terrifying. The reality of Alfred's position was stark. Wessex had been fighting almost continuously for a year, had lost many warriors, was exhausted and demoralized, and was running out of resources to continue the war. Alfred had no choice but to make peace with the Vikings on the best terms he could get. He negotiated a treaty, probably paying the Vikings a substantial sum of money, what later sources would call danegeld, Danish payment, in exchange for their agreement to leave Wessex. The The Vikings accepted the payment and left, but they didn't leave England. Instead, they moved back north into Mercia, where they spent the next few years consolidating their control over that kingdom. For Wessex, this brought a temporary respite from the fighting, a chance to rebuild, to recover from the losses of 871, and to prepare for future conflicts that everyone knew were inevitable. For Ealhswith, these years of relative peace from 871 to 878 were an opportunity to establish herself more firmly in her role. She was now the wife of a king, the Lady of Wessex, if not officially queen, and she had increasing responsibilities. Her household grew larger and more complex as she took on more of the duties associated with being the king's wife. She was responsible for overseeing the domestic arrangements wherever the royal court happened to be, which moved frequently between different royal estates throughout Wessex. She also became more involved in religious patronage. Anglo-Saxon noblewomen were expected to support the church through donations of money, land, and valuable objects. They commissioned religious books, funded the construction or repair of churches, provided vestments and altar vessels for religious services, and supported monasteries through grants of land and other resources. Ealhswith, as the wife of the king, and a woman of considerable personal wealth through her mourning gift and her inherited property, would have been expected to be particularly generous in her religious giving. During these years, Ealhswith and Alfred's children were growing up. Ethelflaed, the eldest, would have been about 6 or 7 years old by the mid-870s, old enough to begin more formal education and to start learning the skills she would need as an adult. Edward was a toddler, and the younger children were infants. Ealhswith would have been deeply involved in their upbringing, particularly for the girls, while Alfred would have overseen the education of the boys as they grew older. Alfred was passionate about education in a way that was unusual for his time. Most kings focused primarily on military matters and left learning to the clergy. But Alfred believed that education was essential for effective leadership and for maintaining Christian civilization against the pagan Vikings. He was himself well educated, could read and write in both Old English and Latin, and was deeply interested in learning of all kinds. He wanted his children to receive the same kind of education, and he was willing to invest considerable resources to make that happen. According to Asser, both Edward and Ealhswith were educated together at the royal court, learning from both male and female tutors. This was highly unusual. Generally, boys and girls received separate educations focusing on different skills, but Alfred insisted that both his son and his daughter learn to read and write, study religious texts, and master the liberal arts. This suggests that both Alfred and Ealhswith valued education for their daughters as well as their sons, seeing learning as appropriate and beneficial for all their children regardless of gender. But even as Ealhswith was establishing her household, raising her children, and supporting her husband's reign, the storm clouds were gathering again. The Vikings had not gone away. They had simply been occupied elsewhere, conquering and settling other parts of England. By the late 870s, they were ready to make another attempt at conquering Wessex, and this time they would come close to succeeding. The winter of 877 and 878 began like many others in Anglo-Saxon England. As autumn turned to winter, the days grew shorter and colder, the leaves fell from the trees, and the fields were harvested for the last time before the earth would rest until spring. Throughout Wessex, people prepared for the cold months ahead, storing grain in their barns, salting and smoking meat to preserve it, bringing their livestock into shelters, and gathering around their hearths as the long winter nights descended. At the royal court, preparations were made for celebrating Christmas and the 12 days that followed. The period from Christmas Day on December 25th through to the Epiphany on January 6th. This was one of the most important festivals in the Christian calendar, commemorating the birth of Christ, and it was celebrated with special religious services, elaborate feasting, and a temporary pause in the normal routines of work and warfare. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the 12 days of Christmas were a time when the normal social order was partially relaxed, when lords gave generous gifts to their followers, when ale and mead flowed freely, and when the darkness of winter was pushed back by firelight, fellowship, and celebration. King Alfred had chosen to spend Christmas of 827 at Chippenham, a royal estate in Wiltshire that was one of his favourite residences. Chippenham was strategically located near the River Avon, with good agricultural land surrounding it, forests nearby that provided game for hunting, and buildings suitable for housing the king and his household. The royal complex at Chippenham would have included a great hall for feasting and ceremonies, private chambers for the royal family, chapels for worship, and numerous outbuildings for storing supplies, housing servants and warriors, and conducting the various activities necessary to support a royal household. Ealhswith was there with Alfred, along with their children. Ethelfled was now about 7 or 8 years old, Ethelgifu around 6, Edward perhaps 3 or 4, and little Ealhswith might have been barely a year old, still an infant in arms. The youngest son, Ethelwerd, may not yet have been born, or if he had been born, he would have been a tiny baby. The royal household also included numerous servants, guards, advisors, priests, and other attendants, perhaps 100 people or more, all gathered at Chippenham for the Christmas celebrations. The festivities would have begun on Christmas Eve with special religious services. The royal family would have attended church, hearing prayers and hymns celebrating the birth of Christ. On Christmas Day itself, there would have been a special Mass in the morning, followed by feasting that would last throughout the day and into the evening. The Great Hall at Chippenham would have been decorated with whatever greenery could be found in midwinter. Evergreen boughs of holly and ivy, perhaps some mistletoe, if any could be found. Fresh rushes would have been laid on the floor, mixed with herbs that release pleasant scents when walked upon. The Christmas feast would have been as elaborate as the winter season allowed. Whole pigs would have been roasted over fires, their skin crackling and their meat tender and juicy. Venison from deer hunted in the royal forests would have been served, along with fowl, geese and ducks and chickens. There would have been fish dishes as well, as fish was considered appropriate for holy days. Bread in abundance, ale flowing freely, perhaps even some precious wine for the most honoured guests, vegetables preserved from the autumn harvest, turnips and parsnips and onions, nuts and dried fruits, cheese and butter, everything the royal kitchens could produce to make the feast memorable. During the feast, there would have been entertainment. Scops, professional poets and musicians, would have performed, singing songs about heroes of old, about the glory of past kings, about battles won and enemies defeated. They might have composed new verses specifically for the occasion, praising King Alfred's victories over the Vikings, celebrating the royal children, and wishing blessings for the year to come. The atmosphere would have been warm and convivial, with the great fire blazing in the central hearth, the ale loosening tongues and warming spirits, and the long winter night held at bay by light and laughter and human fellowship. The 12 days of Christmas continued with similar celebrations each day, though perhaps not quite as elaborate as the Christmas feast itself. There would have been religious services each day, opportunities for the warriors to demonstrate their skills in mock combats or other contests, time for hunting in the winter forests, and always the feasting and drinking that marked these special days. For Ealhswith, these would have been pleasant days, time spent with her family, watching her children enjoy the festivities, seeing her husband relaxed and happy among his loyal followers, and enjoying a brief respite from the constant worries and dangers that had marked Alfred's reign. But on the night of January 5th, or in the very early hours of January 6th, the eve of the Epiphany, the 12th and final night of the Christmas season, everything changed with terrifying suddenness. A Viking army under the command of Guthrum, one of the most dangerous and successful Viking leaders in England, launched a surprise attack on Chippenham. The attack was brilliantly conceived and executed. Winter campaigns were extremely unusual in Anglo-Saxon England. The military system relied on the fyrd, the militia composed of free men who owed military service to their lords and to the king. But the fyrd was not a standing army. It was a force that was called up when needed and then dismissed when the immediate danger had passed. During the winter, the fyrd was always dismissed so that the farmers could return to their homes, tend to their livestock, repair their equipment, and prepare for the spring planting season that would begin in a few months. This meant that in winter, military forces were at their absolute minimum. Kings and great lords would have their personal bodyguards, professional warriors who served year-round. But the larger armies that could be fielded during the summer campaigning season simply didn't exist in winter. Everyone knew this, including the Vikings. And Guthrum, who had been fighting in England for over a decade and knew how the Anglo-Saxon military system worked, saw an opportunity. By attacking during the 12 days of Christmas, when everyone was feasting and celebrating, when ale and wine had been flowing freely for nearly 2 weeks, when military vigilance was at its lowest, Guthrum caught the West Saxons completely off guard. Even the king's bodyguards, who should have been alert at all times, were probably affected by the celebrations and the general atmosphere of relaxation and festivity. When the Vikings came out of the winter darkness, moving swiftly and silently to surround Chippenham, there was almost no time to react. The first warning probably came from sentries on the outskirts of the compound, if they saw anything at all before they were killed. Then suddenly there were Vikings everywhere, warriors pouring into Chippenham, some on horseback, others on foot, all armed and armoured and attacking anyone who resisted. There would have been screaming, the clash of weapons, the smell of blood and smoke as buildings caught fire, the chaos and terror of a surprise attack in the darkness. Inside the royal buildings, Alfred, Ealhswith, and their household were awakened by the sounds of combat and the shouts of alarm. They would have had only minutes, perhaps only seconds, to make the most important decision of their lives. If they stayed, they would almost certainly be captured or killed. Guthrum would have been specifically targeting the king, knowing that if he could capture or kill Alfred, Wessex would collapse. But if they fled immediately, while there was still confusion, and before the Vikings had completely secured the compound, they might escape. Alfred made the decision to flee. He gathered whatever members of his household he could find, Ealhswith, their children, some of his most trusted bodyguards and servants, perhaps a few nobles who happened to be at court, and they ran, in their nightclothes or in whatever they could grab quickly, with no time to pack supplies or gather treasures or organize an orderly departure. They simply fled into the winter night, leaving behind everything, their home, their possessions, their kingdom. For Ealhswith, those moments of flight must have been absolutely terrifying. She had small children to protect. Ethel fled, old enough to run on her own, but young enough to be frightened and confused. Ethelgifu and Edward probably clinging to adults and crying. The baby Ealhswith in someone's arms. They were fleeing from their home while Vikings swarmed through it, killing anyone who resisted. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of violence and destruction, could see the orange glow of flames as buildings were set on fire. could smell the smoke carried on the cold winter wind. They fled south and west, away from Chippenham, into the darkness. They would have followed paths and tracks that they knew, staying away from roads where Vikings might be patrolling, moving as quickly as they could while burdened with small children and hindered by the darkness and the cold. The January night would have been freezing, with frost on the ground and possibly snow. None of them were dressed for outdoor travel in winter. They had been inside, warm and comfortable, when the attack came. Now they were outside in the bitter cold, without warm cloaks or proper shoes, fleeing for their lives. Alfred would have had some idea of where they needed to go. Somewhere safe, somewhere defensible, somewhere the Vikings couldn't easily follow. And he must have thought of Athelney, a place he probably knew from hunting expeditions into Somerset. Athelney was a small island, really just a slightly elevated piece of ground in the Somerset levels, the flat marshland region in the southwestern part of Wessex. It was remote, difficult to access, surrounded by wetlands and bogs that made it nearly impossible to approach unless you knew the hidden paths through the marshes. It would be a miserable place to spend the winter, but it would be safe. The journey from Chippenham to Athelney would have been at least 50 miles, possibly more depending on the route they took. On horseback, travelling on good roads in good weather, this journey might have taken a day or two. But Alfred's party was travelling on foot, avoiding roads, hampered by children and by the need to stay hidden from Viking patrols. The journey probably took several days, maybe as long as a week. During this flight, they would have had to find food and shelter wherever they could. They might have stopped at the homes of loyal thegns who would shelter their king despite the danger. They might have slept in barns or abandoned buildings. They might have gone hungry, sharing whatever scraps of food they could find or beg from poor farmers who had little enough for themselves. For a royal family, accustomed to living in comfort, surrounded by servants and protected by warriors, this experience of being refugees, of being dependent on the charity of others, of sleeping rough and going hungry, must have been humbling and frightening. Ealhswith had to keep her children going throughout this ordeal. She had to comfort them when they were frightened, encourage them when they were tired, somehow find food for them when they were hungry. Ethelflaed, as the eldest at 7 or 8, would have understood at least something of what was happening and might have been able to help with the younger children. But Ethelgifu, Edward, and the baby would have needed constant care and attention, keeping them warm, keeping them fed, keeping them moving when they wanted to rest. This would have fallen primarily to Ealhswith and to whatever servants had managed to flee with the royal family. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that Alfred made his way by wood and swamp to Athelney. This suggests that the route they followed took them through forests and marshlands, staying off the main roads and tracks where Vikings might be searching for them. They would have waded through freezing streams, pushed through undergrowth in dense forests, stumbled over rough ground in the darkness, all while trying to stay hidden and keep moving. Finally, probably sometime in mid-January 878, they reached Athelney. The island was really just a small patch of slightly higher ground, rising about 40 feet above the surrounding marshland, barely 30 acres in size, covered with alder trees, which is what Athelney means, Island of the Princes, or possibly Island of the Alders. It was surrounded by marshes that were waterlogged and treacherous, with hidden pools of deep water and expanses of thick mud that could trap the unwary. To reach the island, you had to know the hidden paths, the narrow strips of slightly firmer ground that wound through the marshes and that were invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The conditions that greeted Ealhswith and her family when they arrived at Athelney must have seemed like a bitter mockery of the comfortable life they had left behind. There were no royal buildings here, no great hall with a roaring fire, no comfortable chambers with warm beds, no servants waiting to attend to their needs. There was just a small island covered with scrubby trees and undergrowth, surrounded by cold, wet, miserable marshland, under a grey winter sky. They would have had to build shelters immediately, rough huts made from whatever timber they could cut and whatever materials they could scavenge. The shelters would have been simple structures, probably not much better than peasant cottages, with walls of woven branches packed with mud to keep out the wind, thatched roofs that leaked when it rained, earthen floors that were always damp and cold, and a central fire pit that provided some warmth, but also filled the interior with smoke, because the ventilation was poor. For Ealhswith, the transition from being the wife of a king, living in royal estates, to being essentially a refugee living in a swamp, must have been incredibly difficult. She had gone from having dozens of servants to attend her every need to having to do most things herself. She had gone from fine gowns and jewellery to wearing whatever rough clothing she could find or make. She had gone from sleeping in a comfortable bed in a private chamber to sleeping on the ground or on rough straw mattresses in a drafty hut that barely kept out the cold and damp. The food situation would have been particularly challenging. Athelney was not a provisioned fortress with stores of grain and salted meat. It was just a patch of marshy ground with no farms, no stored food, no resources except what could be hunted or foraged. The men could hunt waterfowl and marsh birds, could set traps for small game, could try to catch fish from the streams and pools in the marshes. But in January, in the depths of winter, there wasn't much food available, even with hunting and foraging. They would have been constantly hungry, eating whatever meagre meals they could put together, portioning out small amounts to make supplies last as long as possible. For the children, this must have been particularly hard. Young children need regular meals to stay healthy and grow, and the royal children had never experienced real hunger before. Now they were living on thin soups and small portions of whatever food the adults could provide. Little Edward, who was only 3 or 4 years old, and the baby Ælfthryth would have been especially vulnerable. The cold, the damp, the inadequate food, the stress, all of these could have made them sick. The fact that all the children survived this ordeal suggests either remarkable luck or careful attention from their parents and the adults around them. Ealhswith would have had to take on tasks that she had never done before, and that would have been done by servants in normal times. She would have had to help prepare food, such as it was, cooking over an open fire in primitive conditions. She would have had to mend and maintain clothing that was wearing out with no replacement available. She would have had to comfort and care for her children without the assistance of nurses and servants. She would have had to maintain some semblance of royal dignity and authority, even in these reduced circumstances, because the household needed structure and leadership to function even in exile. The winter weather would have made everything worse. January and February in England are cold and damp months, with frequent rain, occasional snow, and temperatures that regularly drop below freezing at night. The marshland around Athelney would have been particularly miserable, perpetually wet, with fog rolling in from the wetlands, with water everywhere making it impossible to stay dry, with the cold seeming to seep into your bones and never leave. But Alfred was not simply hiding at Athelney and waiting for rescue. From this miserable base, he began organizing resistance against the Vikings. He sent out secret messages to loyal thegns throughout Wessex, asking them to stay faithful, to keep their men armed and ready, to prepare for the day when the king would call them to fight back. These messages had to be carried by trusted riders who could slip through the Viking-occupied territory without being caught, and many of them probably succeeded because the Vikings, having conquered most of Wessex, were not expecting organized resistance from what they thought was a defeated enemy. Alfred also began conducting what we would now call guerrilla warfare. From the secure base of Athelney, small bands of warriors would venture out into the surrounding region, attacking Viking patrols and supply columns, raiding Viking camps, and then disappearing back into the marshes before the Vikings could respond in force. These raids kept the Vikings off balance, demonstrated that Alfred was still alive and fighting, and provided the royal household at Athelney with much-needed supplies, weapons, food, clothing, and other goods taken from the Vikings. Every time Alfred led one of these raids, Ealhswith must have watched him leave with terrible anxiety. Would he return? Would this be the raid where he was caught and killed, leaving her a widow with 4 young children to protect in the middle of a hostile, occupied kingdom? The waiting must have been agonizing. Hours or days of not knowing, of trying to keep the children calm and occupied, of maintaining hope when everything seemed hopeless. The period at Athelney became the source of many legends about Alfred, the most famous being the story of Alfred and the burning cakes. According to this tale, which first appears in sources written over a century after Alfred's death, the king was taking shelter in the home of a poor peasant woman who didn't recognize him. She asked him to watch some cakes that were baking by the fire while she went to tend to other chores. But Alfred was so preoccupied with planning his campaign against the Vikings that he forgot about the cakes, and they burned. When the woman returned and saw the burned cakes, she scolded Alfred for his carelessness, not knowing she was berating the king himself. Whether this story is true or not, and most historians think it's probably a later invention, it captures something important about Alfred's situation at Athelney. He was reduced to such desperate circumstances that he was dependent on the charity of common people, living in conditions little better than peasants, far removed from the royal dignity and comfort he had known. The story also captures Alfred's character as someone who was constantly thinking, planning, worrying about his responsibilities, so focused on his duty that he could forget even basic tasks. For Ealhswith, the months at Athelney must have felt endless. January turned to February, February to March, with no end to their exile in sight. But as winter slowly began to turn towards spring, Alfred's situation was actually improving, though it might not have seemed that way to someone living in the cold, damp marshes. The messages he had sent out were bearing fruit. Throughout Wessex, loyal thegns were quietly organizing, keeping their warriors ready, storing weapons and supplies, preparing for the day when Alfred would call them to battle. At Easter in 878, which fell on March 23rd that year, Alfred took a significant step. He formally established a fortification at Athelney, building proper defences around the island, probably earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades with gates that could be closed and defended. This marked a shift from merely hiding to actively preparing for a counterattack. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that, after Easter King Alfred with a small force made a stronghold at Athelney, and from that stronghold kept fighting against the enemy. The timing was significant. Easter was the most important festival in the Christian calendar, celebrating the resurrection of Christ from the dead. By building his stronghold at Easter, Alfred was making a symbolic statement. Just as Christ had risen from the dead, so Alfred would rise from defeat to victory. Just as Easter marked the end of the fasting and penance of Lent and the beginning of celebration, so Alfred's fortification at Athelney marked the end of defensive hiding and the beginning of offensive action. For the royal household at Athelney, the construction of proper fortifications must have been a welcome development. Real defensive walls meant greater security, which meant less fear of being discovered and attacked by Vikings. The work of construction, cutting timber, moving earth, building palisades, would have given the men purposeful activity instead of just sitting and waiting. And the existence of fortifications meant that Alfred was serious about fighting back, that he hadn't given up, that there was hope. As Easter passed and spring progressed, Alfred began more aggressive military action. Raids out of Athelney became more frequent and more ambitious, and Alfred was now in contact with his supporters throughout Wessex, coordinating their activities, building toward a major campaign. But he had to time this carefully. If he called up the fire too soon, before the spring planting was done, the farmers would resent being pulled away from work that determined whether they would eat next winter. If he waited too long, the Vikings would have more time to consolidate their control and more opportunity to discover his plans. For 7 weeks after Easter, Alfred continued his preparations. Warriors began gathering at Athelney, arriving in small groups to avoid attracting attention, bringing their weapons and equipment ready to fight for their king. Supplies were accumulated, food to feed an army, weapons to arm them, everything needed for a major campaign. And messages went out to the ealdormen throughout Wessex, telling them where and when to bring their forces. The gathering point was to be a place called Egbert's Stone, somewhere on the border between Somerset and Wiltshire. This was probably a well-known landmark, perhaps a large standing stone, a natural rock formation, or some other distinctive feature that everyone would recognize. The date was set for the 7th week after Easter, which would be in early May, after the spring planting was finished, but early enough in the campaigning season to allow time for a full campaign. As the appointed day approached, Ealhswith and the children remained at Athelney. This was both for their safety. Athelney was still the most secure location, and taking women and children on campaign would have been difficult and dangerous, and because Alfred needed to travel fast and couldn't be burdened with the responsibility of protecting his family while also commanding an army. But the separation must have been agonizing for Ealhswith. Her husband was about to lead an army into battle against the Vikings. Everything depended on this campaign. If Alfred won, they could reclaim their kingdom. If he lost, Wessex would fall, and she and her children would probably be captured or killed. The parting between Alfred and Ealhswith, as he left Athelney to ride to Egbert's Stone, must have been emotional. They both knew that this might be the last time they saw each other. Alfred might be killed in the coming battle, or he might win the battle but be killed in the subsequent campaigning. There were no guarantees, no assurances that everything would be all right. All they could do was pray, hope, and trust in God and in Alfred's military skill. Alfred rode out of Athelney with his small band of warriors, heading northeast toward Egbert's Stone. The question that must have haunted him, and probably haunted Ealhswith as she watched him leave, was whether anyone would actually come to meet him. He had sent out messages calling the Fyrd to muster, but would people respond? After months of Viking occupation, after seeing their king seemingly defeated and disappeared, would the people of Wessex still be willing to fight? Or would Alfred arrive at Egbert's Stone to find himself alone, his messages ignored, his kingdom truly lost? The answer came when Alfred reached Egbert's Stone. Men were there, warriors from Somerset, from Wiltshire, from Hampshire, from all across Wessex. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, armed and ready to fight, having left their farms and homes to answer their king's call. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that when the men of Wessex saw that their king was alive and ready to fight, they received him as if one risen from the dead, and they were filled with great joy. It must have been an extraordinary moment. For months, many of these men had probably believed their king was dead, or had fled overseas like so many other defeated rulers. They had been living under Viking occupation, watching their country be conquered, feeling helpless and defeated. Now suddenly here was Alfred, alive, defiant, gathering an army, ready to fight back. The emotional impact must have been tremendous. Hope reborn, courage renewed, the possibility of victory suddenly real again. Alfred didn't waste time celebrating the reunion. He immediately began organizing his forces, arranging them into a proper army, preparing for the march north toward the Viking positions. The Vikings, under Guthrum, had been using Chippenham as their base, the same royal estate where they had surprised Alfred back in January. Guthrum must have felt secure there, having conquered most of Wessex. With no significant resistance for months, he probably knew that Alfred had survived and was somewhere in the marshes of Somerset, but he may have thought that Alfred was too weak to pose a serious threat. From Egbert's Stone, Alfred led his army north. They marched for 2 days, moving through the Wessex countryside toward the Viking position. The location of the decisive battle was a place called Edington in Wiltshire, probably not far from Chippenham itself. The armies met there in May 878, and the battle that followed would determine the fate of Anglo-Saxon England. Back at Athelney, Ealhswith could only wait and pray. She would have had no immediate news of the battle. Communications moved at the speed of a riding horse, and even after the battle was over, it would take time for a messenger to make the journey back to Athelney with news. For days, Ealhswith and her household would have waited in agonizing uncertainty, not knowing whether Alfred had won or lost, whether he was alive or dead, whether they would soon be celebrating victory or preparing to flee again, or perhaps to surrender to the Vikings. The Battle of Edington was fought sometime in mid-May 878. The exact date isn't recorded, but it was probably around May 12th, based on calculations from the chronicler's description of when the events occurred relative to Easter. The battle raged throughout the day. Both sides had strong motivation to win. For the Vikings, victory would complete their conquest of England, giving them control of the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. For the West Saxons, victory meant survival and the possibility of reclaiming their kingdom, while defeat meant the end of everything. The Anglo-Saxon forces formed their traditional shield wall, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a wall of wood and iron that was difficult to break through. The Vikings formed their own shield wall, and the two formations clashed together in the brutal, grinding combat that characterized Dark Age warfare. Men in the front ranks stabbed with spears through gaps in the enemy shield wall, trying to wound or kill the warriors opposite them. When spears broke or were lost, they drew swords or axes and continued fighting at close quarters. Warriors in the rear ranks pressed forward, adding their weight and strength to the push, trying to break the enemy formation. For hours, the battle continued. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Men fell on both sides, wounded or killed, and others stepped forward to take their places. The din of battle would have been overwhelming. The clash of weapons against shields, the screams of wounded men, the shouts of warriors encouraging their comrades, the commands of leaders trying to direct their forces. The smell of blood and sweat and fear would have filled the air. Every man knew that his life depended on the man standing next to him, that if the shield wall broke, they would all die. Finally, after hours of combat, the West Saxon line began to push forward. Slowly at first, step by step, the Vikings were driven back. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that Alfred fought against the entire army and put it to flight, though this poetic description probably obscures the actual complexity of the battle. But the essential fact was clear. Alfred won. The Viking shield wall broke, and the Vikings fled, pursued by Alfred's warriors. Many Vikings were killed in the rout, cut down as they fled or exhausted and trapped. The survivors fell back to their fortified camp, probably at Chippenham, where they had fortifications and supplies. But Alfred's forces surrounded the camp, laying siege to it, cutting off any supplies or reinforcements. For 2 weeks, the siege continued. The Vikings, trapped inside their fortifications, began to run out of food. They could see that there was no relief coming, no help from other Viking armies. They had no choice but to surrender. When word finally reached Athelney that Alfred had won the Battle of Edington, that the Vikings had been defeated and were now besieged at Chippenham, that the king was alive and victorious, Ealhswith's relief must have been overwhelming. After months of terror and uncertainty, after living as refugees in a marsh, after watching her husband ride away to a battle that could have been his death, victory had come. Alfred had done what seemed impossible. He had defeated the seemingly invincible Viking army, had reclaimed Wessex from occupation, had saved his kingdom from conquest. But the full story of Alfred's victory was even more remarkable than simply winning the battle. After the Vikings surrendered, Alfred didn't simply slaughter them all or drive them into the sea, as would have been perfectly acceptable and even expected by the standards of the time. Instead, he offered terms that demonstrated his wisdom as a statesman and his vision for the future of England. The terms were these: Guthrum, the Viking leader, and his principal men would accept Christian baptism. The Vikings would leave Wessex and return to the territories they controlled in eastern England. In return, Alfred would allow them to leave with their lives and would recognize their right to rule over those eastern territories. Alfred was essentially offering the Vikings the chance to stop being raiders and conquerors and instead become settlers and rulers of a legitimate kingdom, provided they converted to Christianity and agreed to live in peace with Wessex. 3 weeks after the surrender, Guthrum and 30 of his leading warriors came to Alfred to be baptized. The ceremony took place at a place called Aller, near Athelney, which was fitting given that Athelney had been Alfred's refuge during his darkest hour. The baptism was conducted by clergy according to the full rites of the church. Guthrum and his men would have been instructed in the basic beliefs of Christianity: the Trinity, the Incarnation, the resurrection, the promise of salvation through faith in Christ. They would have been asked to renounce their pagan beliefs and to pledge their faith in the Christian God. Then they would have been baptized, probably by immersion in a river or font, and they would have taken Christian names. Guthrum chose the name Athelstan, which was a good English name meaning noble stone. Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather, which created a spiritual kinship between them that was taken very seriously in medieval Christianity. A godfather had responsibilities toward his godchild, and the relationship was considered sacred. By standing as Guthrum's godfather, Alfred was binding Guthrum to him not just through a political treaty, but through the most powerful oath possible in the Christian world, a sacred vow made before God. The baptism ceremony was followed by 12 days of celebration, during which Alfred entertained Guthrum and his men, demonstrating the magnanimity of victory and establishing a new relationship based not on warfare, but on peace and Christian brotherhood. Then the Vikings departed for East Anglia, where they would settle and establish what would become part of the Danelaw, a region of England under Scandinavian law and settlement, but now at peace with Wessex. With the Vikings departed and Wessex liberated, Ealhswith and her family were finally able to leave Athelney. After nearly 4 months in the marshes, January through April, living in primitive conditions, hungry and cold and frightened, they could now return to royal estates, to comfortable buildings, to adequate food and warmth and safety. The relief and joy must have been indescribable, but the experience of those months at Athelney would have changed everyone who lived through it. Ealhswith and Alfred had learned what it was like to lose everything, to be refugees dependent on the charity of others, to face the real possibility of defeat and death. Their children, especially Ethelflaed, who was old enough to remember everything clearly, had experienced terror and hardship that most royal children never knew. The entire royal family had been tested by fire and had survived. For Ealhswith specifically, the months at Athelney may have given her a deeper appreciation for the lives of ordinary people, the peasants and farmers who lived hard lives, who went hungry when harvest failed, who lived in simple homes with few comforts, who faced danger and uncertainty as a normal part of existence. Most royal women never experienced anything like what Ealhswith had experienced at Athelney. They lived sheltered lives, surrounded by servants and luxury, never really understanding what life was like for the vast majority of their subjects. Ealhswith now knew because she had lived it herself, and that knowledge might have made her more compassionate, more aware of the real needs of ordinary people, more committed to using her position and resources to help those in need. The years following the victory at Edington and the Treaty of Wedmore marked a fundamental transformation in the fortunes of Wessex and in the life of Ealhswith and her family. After years of crisis and near-constant warfare, after the terror of the flight from Chippenham and the months of exile at Athelney, they could finally return to something resembling a normal life. But both Alfred and Ealhswith understood that the peace they had won was fragile and could be shattered at any moment if Wessex was not prepared to defend itself. Ealhswith and the children left Athelney sometime in the spring or early summer of 878, probably travelling first to Winchester, which was Alfred's primary residence and the capital of Wessex. Winchester was an ancient city with Roman origins, built at a strategic location where several important routes converged. The Romans had called it Venta Belgarum and had surrounded it with substantial walls that still stood, though in varying states of repair, in the 9th century. After the Roman withdrawal from Britain, Winchester had declined like most Roman cities, but it had remained an important centre and had become the primary royal residence for the kings of Wessex. Returning to Winchester after months in the marshes must have felt like entering paradise to Ealhswith and her children. Here were solid buildings with proper roofs that didn't leak, with real floors instead of muddy earth, with fireplaces that drew properly so the smoke went up and out instead of filling the room. Here were beds with mattresses and blankets and pillows instead of sleeping on the ground. Here was food in abundance, bread and meat and vegetables, ale and even wine, proper cooked meals instead of thin soups and whatever scraps they could scrounge at Athelney. The royal complex at Winchester would have been bustling with activity as the court reassembled. Servants who had fled or hidden during the Viking occupation returned to their duties. Noble families came to Winchester to renew their oaths of loyalty to Alfred, to celebrate the victory over the Vikings, and to position themselves for influence at court. Clergy arrived to give thanks to God for Wessex's deliverance and to receive Alfred's patronage for their churches and monasteries. The wheels of government, which had essentially stopped during the crisis, began turning again. For Ealhswith, there was an enormous amount of work to be done in re-establishing the royal household. During the months of exile and Viking occupation, the normal operations of the household had completely broken down. Now everything had to be rebuilt. Servants had to be rehired or their duties reassigned. Supplies had to be obtained to stock the kitchens and storerooms. The physical buildings had to be repaired where damage had occurred during the occupation. And the complex web of relationships and protocols that governed daily life at court had to be re-established. Ealhswith would have been central to this work. As the lady of the household, it was her responsibility to ensure that the domestic side of the court functioned properly. She would have directed servants in cleaning and preparing the royal quarters, would have overseen the kitchens to ensure adequate food supplies and proper meal preparation, would have managed the production of textiles, both for the royal family's clothing and for other uses like bedding and wall hangings. She would have re-established the daily routines and schedules that governed court life, determining when meals would be served, when religious services would be held, how visitors would be received and entertained. But Ealhswith's work was not just domestic. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the management of a great household was a form of governance in itself. The royal court was not just a private residence, but the seat of government, the place where the kingdom's business was conducted. By managing the household efficiently, by ensuring that visiting nobles and foreign ambassadors were properly hosted and impressed, by maintaining the dignity and splendor appropriate to a royal court, Ealhswith was supporting Alfred's rule and enhancing his prestige. During this period, Alfred was implementing sweeping reforms designed to ensure that Wessex would never again come so close to destruction as it had in 878. His experiences during the Viking Wars, and especially the near disaster of 878, had taught him valuable lessons about military organization and defense. The traditional Anglo-Saxon military system, based on the fired militia that was called up only when needed and then dismissed, had proven inadequate against the Vikings' professional armies and their strategy of year-round campaigning. Alfred's solution was multifaceted. First, he began building a network of fortified towns called burhs throughout Wessex. These burhs were placed strategically so that no one in the kingdom was more than 20 miles, about a day's journey on foot, from a place of refuge. Each burh was fortified with earthen ramparts and timber palisades, had gates that could be closed and defended, and had a garrison of warriors responsible for its defense. When Viking raiders appeared, the local population could flee to the nearest burh for protection, and the garrison could hold out until reinforcements arrived. The construction of these burhs was an enormous undertaking that required tremendous resources and organization. Land had to be acquired or appropriated for each burh site. Thousands of workers had to be mobilized to dig ditches, build ramparts, construct palisades, and create the infrastructure, wells, granaries, barracks, needed to support a functioning fortified town. The whole kingdom had to be surveyed and planned to determine where burhs should be located for maximum strategic advantage. Alfred also reformed the fyrd system itself. Instead of calling up all able-bodied men when danger threatened and leaving farms unattended and unprotected, Alfred divided the fyrd into 2 shifts. Half the militia would be on active duty at any given time, serving in the army or manning the burhs, while the other half remained at home to tend their farms and families. Then the 2 groups would switch. This meant that Alfred always had a substantial military force available, even during the planting and harvest seasons when farmers had traditionally been unavailable for military service. Additionally, Alfred began building a navy, a fleet of ships designed to intercept Viking raiders at sea before they could reach the English coast. This was innovative thinking. Most Anglo-Saxon kings had focused entirely on land warfare, allowing the Vikings to control the seas and to raid where and when they pleased. Alfred understood that to truly defend against Vikings, who came by sea in their swift longships, you needed to be able to fight them on the water, to intercept their fleets before they could land and establish bases. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alfred designed a new type of ship specifically for fighting Vikings. These ships were longer than Viking longships, with more oars and thus more speed and power. They were also higher, giving English sailors an advantage in the close-quarters combat that characterized naval warfare in this period. Boarding enemy ships and fighting hand-to-hand on the decks, Whether these new ships were as successful as Alfred hoped is debatable. The sources record instances of them running aground or being damaged in storms. But the important thing was that Alfred was thinking strategically and innovatively about how to defend his kingdom. While Alfred was implementing these military reforms, Ealhswith was raising their children and preparing them for the roles they would play in the kingdom's future. The experience at Athelney had bonded the family together in ways that wouldn't have happened in normal circumstances. They had faced extreme danger together, had survived together, had seen their father and husband lead the kingdom back from the brink of destruction. This shared experience would have given the children a strong sense of family loyalty and a deep understanding of both the responsibilities and the fragility of power. Ethelfled, the eldest daughter, was growing into a formidable young woman. By the early 880s, she would have been in her early teens, old enough to begin taking on adult responsibilities, old enough to start thinking about marriage. In most noble families, daughters were married off as teenagers to create alliances with other powerful families. But Alfred seems to have had specific plans for Ethelfled, plans that would tie directly into his strategic vision for resisting the Vikings and eventually uniting the English kingdoms. To the north of Wessex lay Mercia, or what remained of it. Eastern Mercia was part of the Danelaw, under Viking control. But Western Mercia remained independent under a ruler named Ethelred, who held the title of Lord of the Mercians. Ethelred was not a king. Mercia no longer had kings after the Viking conquests, but he was effectively the ruler of what remained of the once great Mercian kingdom. He had accepted Alfred's overlordship, recognizing the King of Wessex as his superior, which meant that Wessex and Mercia were allied. But this alliance needed to be strengthened and made permanent. Alfred's solution was a marriage alliance. Sometime in the mid to late 880s, probably around 886 or 887, Ethelfled was married to Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians. For Ealhswith, this must have been a momentous occasion. Her eldest daughter, the child who had been born during the Viking Wars and who had survived the ordeal at Athelney, was now becoming the Lady of the Mercians, ruling over the very kingdom from which Ealhswith herself had come. The marriage served multiple purposes. It bound Mercia and Wessex together through family ties, making the alliance more secure. It placed a member of the West Saxon royal family in a position of power in Mercia, which would help Alfred extend his influence over that kingdom. And it honoured Ealhswith's own Mercian heritage. Through Ethelfled, Ealhswith's Mercian royal blood would return to rule over Mercia itself. For Ethelfled, the marriage meant leaving her family and going to live in Mercia. The capital of English Mercia at this time was probably Gloucester, a fortified town on the River Severn that was strategically important for controlling the border between English and Danish Mercia. Ethelfled would have had to establish herself there, taking on the role of Lady of the Mercians, learning to govern alongside her husband Ethelred, and beginning to build the network of relationships and loyalties that would serve her well when she later ruled Mercia in her own right. For Ealhswith, watching her daughter leave for Mercia must have been bittersweet. She was losing her eldest child, who had been her companion through so many trials, but she was also seeing her daughter rise to a position of great power and importance, and there must have been a special satisfaction in knowing that Ealhswith's own Mercian heritage, her royal blood from the Mercian royal house, would now help to rule Mercia through her daughter. Ethelgifu, the second daughter, followed a different path. From early in her life, she had been destined for religious life rather than marriage. Whether this was due to health problems, a physical disability, or simply a family decision to dedicate one child to God's service, we don't know. But sometime in the early 890s, Alfred formally founded Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, specifically to serve as a religious house for his daughter. Shaftesbury Abbey was far more richly endowed than most monasteries. Alfred granted it 1/16 of his entire royal revenue, an enormous sum that made Shaftesbury one of the wealthiest religious foundations in England. This generous endowment served several purposes. It ensured that Athelney would live comfortably and securely for the rest of her life, with the resources to maintain a proper household and to fulfill her religious duties. It demonstrated Alfred's piety and his commitment to supporting the church, and it created a powerful religious institution that would pray for Alfred's soul and for his dynasty for generations to come. Athelney was appointed as the first abbess of Shaftesbury, probably when she was still quite young, perhaps only in her late teens or early 20s. This was a position of considerable responsibility. As abbess, she would be responsible for overseeing the spiritual life of the monastery, ensuring that the nuns under her care followed the monastic rule properly, managing the monastery's extensive properties and resources, and representing the monastery in its dealings with the outside world. For Ealhswith, having a daughter serve as abbess of such an important monastery was both an honour and a source of comfort. It meant that Athelney would be praying for the family daily, interceding with God on their behalf. It meant that one of Ealhswith's children would be dedicated entirely to spiritual matters, living a life of prayer and devotion that would bring blessings on the entire family. And it meant that Ealhswith herself would have a spiritual connection to Shaftesbury Abbey, which she could visit, and where she might even find refuge in her old age if she wished. Sadly, Athelney did not live long. She died sometime before her father Alfred's death in 899, probably around 896, when she would have been only about 20 years old. The cause of her death is not recorded. It could have been illness, complications from the health problems that may have led to her dedication to religious life, or any of the numerous dangers that claimed young lives in the 9th century. For Ealhswith, losing a child must have been devastating, even though infant and childhood mortality was common enough that most parents experienced such loss. Athelney had been her daughter, had been part of the family that survived Athelney together, and now she was gone. Edward, the eldest son and heir to the throne, was receiving the comprehensive education that Alfred believed was essential for effective kingship. According to Asser, Edward was educated at court alongside his sister Ealhswith, learning from both male and female tutors. This education included literacy in both Old English and Latin, study of religious texts, including the Psalms and the Gospels, and training in the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But Edward's education wasn't purely academic. He also received military training, learning to ride and fight, to command men in battle, to understand strategy and tactics. When he was about 19 years old, in 893, Edward was given command of part of the West Saxon army and led them to victory against a Viking raid at the Battle of Farnham in Surrey. This demonstrated that Edward had inherited not just his father's love of learning, but also his military skill and courage. For Ealhswith, watching her son prove himself as both a scholar and a warrior must have been deeply satisfying. Edward would need both qualities when he eventually inherited the throne. He would need to be able to defend the kingdom militarily against continued Viking threats, but he would also need to be able to govern wisely, to maintain the reforms Alfred had implemented, and to continue the work of uniting the English kingdoms under West Saxon leadership. Ealhswith, the youngest daughter, was also educated alongside her brother Edward, a remarkable example of Alfred's belief that education was valuable for daughters as well as sons. Ealhswith's future lay in marriage, but not to an English nobleman. Instead, she was married around 893 to Baldwin II, Count of Flanders, a powerful nobleman who ruled over the wealthy and strategically important region of Flanders on the continent, in what is now Belgium and northern France. This marriage connected the English royal family to continental European nobility and created an alliance that had both diplomatic and military value. Flanders was important for trade, controlling ports that English merchants needed to access continental markets. It was also strategically located between the emerging kingdoms of France and Germany, making its ruler a significant player in European politics. By marrying Ealhswith to Baldwin, Alfred was establishing England as a participant in continental diplomacy, rather than just an isolated island kingdom focused solely on its own internal struggles. For Ealhswith, this marriage meant that her youngest daughter would be farther away than any of her other children, not just in a different part of England, but across the English Channel in a foreign land. Ealhswith would be ruling alongside her husband as Countess of Flanders, would be bearing and raising her own children in Flanders, would be living a life that would take her far from her family in England. The separation must have been painful for Ealhswith, knowing that she would probably rarely see this daughter, that letters would take weeks to travel between England and Flanders, that Ealhswith was truly leaving to make a new life in a new land. But there was also pride in seeing Ealhswith rise to such a position. As Countess of Flanders, she would be one of the most important noblewomen on the continent, and through her descendants, Ealhswith's bloodline would have a lasting impact on European history. Ealhswith was an ancestress of Matilda of Flanders, who would marry William the Conqueror and become Queen of England after the Norman conquest of 1066. This meant that even after the Norman conquest, even after the Anglo-Saxon royal line was overthrown, Ealhswith's descendants would continue to rule England. The youngest son, Ethelwerd, received an even more scholarly education than his brother Edward, including extensive training in Latin that would normally suggest he was intended for a career in the church. But Ethelwerd later married and had children, so he clearly wasn't meant to be a monk or priest. Instead, he seems to have been groomed to serve as a learned counselor and administrator, someone who could use his education to help his brother Edward govern the kingdom, to handle diplomatic correspondence, to advise on complex legal and administrative matters. While her children were growing up and preparing for their adult roles, Ealhswith was also pursuing her own projects. One of the most significant was her founding of the Nunnaminster, also known as St. Mary's Abbey, in Winchester. The exact chronology of Nunnaminster's foundation is somewhat unclear in the sources, but it was probably begun during Alfred's reign, perhaps in the late 880s or early 890s, and was completed after Alfred's death by Ealhswith and her son Edward. The founding of a monastery was a major undertaking that required enormous resources and sustained effort over many years. Ealhswith first needed to acquire the land on which the monastery would be built. She may have used property that Alfred had granted to her as her mourning gift after their marriage, or she may have used land that she had inherited, or Alfred may have granted her additional estate specifically for this purpose. The location chosen was in Winchester itself, close to the Old Minster, the cathedral, and to the royal complex, placing the new monastery at the very heart of the kingdom's religious and political life. Once the land was secured, construction could begin. The initial buildings were constructed of timber in the Anglo-Saxon style, which was standard for the period. The church that formed the centre of the monastery was designed with a distinctive double acidal entrance at the west end, an unusual architectural feature that gave the building ceremonial grandeur and made it clear that this was a royal foundation, not just an ordinary parish church. The church was about 6.5 meters wide, large enough to accommodate the community of nuns who would worship there, but not so enormous as to be impractical given the available resources and technology. In addition to the church, other buildings were needed. The nuns required living quarters, dormitories where they would sleep, a refectory where they would eat their meals, a chapter house where they would meet daily to conduct the monastery's business and to read from the monastic rule. There needed to be workshops where the nuns could engage in productive labor, weaving cloth, copying manuscripts, preparing medicines, and doing the other work that supported the monastery and fulfilled the monastic requirement that monks and nuns support themselves through their own labor rather than living idly on charity. The monastery also needed infrastructure, a kitchen for preparing food, a bakehouse for making bread, storerooms for keeping supplies, a well or other water source, latrines for sanitation, and enclosing walls to mark off the monastery's sacred space from the surrounding secular world. All of this had to be planned, funded, constructed, and equipped. A massive project that probably took years to complete. While the physical buildings were being constructed, Ealhswith was also working on recruiting the first nuns, who would form the monastery's community. These needed to be women from noble or at least respectable families. Monasteries drew their members from the upper classes of society, as the life of a nun required literacy and some education, which poor women usually didn't have. Ealhswith may have personally contacted families she knew, inviting them to dedicate their daughters to religious life at the new monastery. She would have emphasized the monastery's royal patronage, its generous endowment, and the honor associated with being part of the founding community. The first abbess of Nunnaminster was a woman named Athelney. Whether this was a different woman who happened to share a name with Alfred's daughter Ealhswith, or whether it was actually Ealhswith herself serving temporarily as abbess before her marriage to Baldwin of Flanders, is unclear in the sources. The name Athelney was common enough that it could easily have been a different person. But whoever she was, the first abbess had the crucial responsibility of establishing the monastery's routines and traditions, training the nuns in the monastic rule they would follow, and setting the spiritual tone for the community. Ealhswith brought to Nunnaminster a precious manuscript, a 9th century book of Psalms that had probably come from Mercia and may have been used by Mercian noblewomen. This manuscript, known today as the Book of Nunnaminster, is now preserved in the British Library. Analysis of its text reveals that it was likely written by female scribes, as some portions use feminine grammatical forms. This precious book would have been used by the nuns at Nunnaminster for their daily prayers and worship, and its presence suggests that Ealhswith was contributing to the monastery's library and ensuring that the nuns had the religious texts they needed for their spiritual lives. The founding of Nunnaminster was significant for several reasons beyond just creating another religious house. First, it provided a respectable and honoured place for unmarried or widowed noblewomen. In Anglo-Saxon society, women who didn't marry or whose husbands died faced potential vulnerability. Without a man to protect and provide for them, they could find themselves in difficult circumstances. Monasteries offered an alternative, a place where women could live secure, comfortable, and honoured lives dedicated to prayer and learning. Second, Nunnaminster created an educational centre. Monasteries typically ran schools, and Nunnaminster would have educated girls from noble families, teaching them to read and write, instructing them in religious texts, and preparing them either for religious life or for their roles as noble wives and mothers. This was one of the few ways that girls in Anglo-Saxon England could receive formal education. Third, the monastery was a statement of royal piety and power. The ability to found and richly endow a major religious institution demonstrated both wealth and commitment to the Christian faith. It showed that the royal family took seriously its responsibility to support the church and to provide for the salvation of souls. And it created an institution that would pray for Alfred, Ealhswith, and their descendants for generations, a spiritual investment in the family's future. Fourth, Nunnaminster gave Ealhswith a project that was truly her own. While she could never be called queen, while she rarely appeared in official documents during Alfred's reign, while she operated mostly in the background compared to her husband, Nunnaminster was hers. She founded it, she funded it, she recruited its first members, she oversaw its construction. In later sources, she is specifically identified as the builder of Nunnaminster, acknowledging her role as its founder. This gave her agency and independence, allowing her to make a lasting contribution to Winchester and to Wessex that would be remembered long after her death. As the 890s progressed, Alfred's health began to decline. He had never been entirely healthy, suffering from the mysterious illness that had first struck him on his wedding day and that continued to cause him periodic bouts of pain throughout his life. Now, as he entered his 50s, old age by the standards of the 9th century, his health was failing more seriously. He remained mentally sharp and continued to govern actively, but it was becoming clear that he didn't have many more years left. Alfred began making preparations for his death and for the succession. He wanted to ensure that his son Edward would inherit the throne without challenge, that potential rivals would have no grounds to dispute Edward's claim, and that his daughters and other family members would be provided for. He also wanted to ensure that his projects, particularly his educational and religious reforms, would continue after his death. In the late 890s, Alfred composed his will, a document that has survived and that provides fascinating insights into his priorities and his relationships. The will begins with a long preamble explaining the history of various properties and how they had come into Alfred's possession, establishing his legal right to dispose of them as he wished. Then it specifies what should happen to his property after his death. To his sons, Alfred left the largest bequests. Edward, as the heir apparent, received the lion's share of the kingdom's resources, while Ethelwerd received substantial estates that would allow him to live as a wealthy nobleman and advisor to his brother. To his daughters, Alfred left estates and money. Ethelgifu, who had already died by the time the will was finalized, had previously received estates at Preston, Candover, and Kingsclere in Hampshire. Ethelfled, as Lady of the Mercians, probably didn't receive additional bequests as she was already provided for through her position. Ealhswith, as Countess of Flanders, similarly had her own resources, but Alfred also left substantial bequests to Ealhswith. She received 3 estates that were deeply symbolic. Edington in Wiltshire, where Alfred had won his great victory over the Vikings in 878, Lambourne in Berkshire, and Wantage, which was Alfred's own birthplace. He also left her £100 in cash, which was a considerable sum. These bequests weren't just generous, they were Alfred's way of acknowledging Ealhswith's role in his life and reign. By leaving her the estate at Edington, he was recognizing that she had been with him through the darkest days at Athelney, that the victory at Edington belonged to both of them. Importantly, these estates were designated as bookland, which meant Ealhswith would have complete control over them. She could keep the income from them during her lifetime, and she could decide who would inherit them after her death. This gave her economic independence and legal autonomy. She wouldn't be dependent on her son's generosity, but would have her own wealth and property. Alfred the Great died on October 26, 899, probably at Winchester. He was about 50 years old, having reigned as King of Wessex for 28 years. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of the man who had saved Wessex from Viking conquest, who had begun the process of uniting the English kingdoms, who had promoted learning and education in an age when such things were rare, and who had earned the title, the Great, that only one other English king would ever bear. For Ealhswith, Alfred's death must have been devastating. She had been married to him for 31 years. They had faced exile and terror together at Athelney, had raised 5 children together, had seen those children grow and take on important roles, and had worked side by side to defend and strengthen their kingdom. Alfred had been not just her husband, but her partner, her companion through decades of crisis and triumph. Now he was gone, and she was a widow at about 50 years old. Alfred was initially buried in the Old Minster in Winchester, the ancient cathedral that stood in the heart of the city. The funeral would have been an elaborate affair, with clergy from throughout Wessex coming to Winchester to participate, with noble families attending to pay their respects, and with multiple days of religious services and ceremonies. Alfred's body would have been carried in procession to the Old Minster, placed in a tomb near the high altar, and committed to God's care with prayers for his soul's salvation. But Alfred had commissioned the construction of a new church, the New Minster, which he had intended to serve as a mausoleum for himself and his descendants. The New Minster wasn't quite finished at the time of Alfred's death, but his son Edward would complete it within a few years. When the New Minster was finished, Alfred's body was moved from the Old Minster to the new church, where it was reinterred in a place of honour before the high altar. With Alfred's death, Edward became King of Wessex, but his succession wasn't entirely smooth. A cousin named Ethelwald, who was the son of Alfred's elder brother King Ethelred, claimed that he had a better right to the throne. According to Anglo-Saxon tradition, when a king died, the crown could pass to an adult brother or cousin, rather than to a young son, ensuring that the kingdom would have experienced leadership. Ethelwald argued that when his father King Ethelred had died in 871, he had been passed over only because he was a child. Now he was an adult, and he claimed the throne should have been his all along. Ethelwald seized the royal estates at Wimborne and Christchurch in Dorset, and prepared to fight for what he saw as his rightful inheritance. He even took a nun from Wimborne Abbey with him, whether by force or with her consent is unclear. This was probably an attempt to strengthen his claim, as marriage to a royal woman, even one who had taken religious vows, could potentially bolster his legitimacy. Edward responded swiftly and decisively, marching on Wimborne with an army. Ethelwald realised he couldn't hold out and fled north to join the Vikings of Northumbria. He spent the next few years leading Viking raids against Wessex before finally being killed in battle in 902. For Ealhswith, this succession crisis must have been deeply worrying. Her son's right to rule was being challenged, and the kingdom that she and Alfred had worked so hard to preserve was threatened by civil war. But there was little she could do directly. As a woman, she couldn't lead armies or negotiate treaties. Her role was to support Edward however she could, to maintain the dignity of the royal household, and to use her influence behind the scenes to help stabilize her son's reign. One thing Ealhswith could do was complete the founding of Nunnaminster. The monastery had been begun during Alfred's lifetime, but it may not have been fully established and functioning when he died. After Alfred's death, Ealhswith seems to have taken it upon herself to finish the work, ensuring that the buildings were completed, that the community of nuns was fully established, and that the monastery was properly endowed with the resources it needed to function. Completing Nunnaminster served several purposes. It fulfilled a religious obligation, ensuring that prayers would be said for Alfred's soul and for the royal family. It provided Ealhswith with meaningful work during her widowhood, giving her a project to focus on during a time of grief and transition, and it demonstrated that the royal family was stable and confident enough to be undertaking major building projects, a way of showing that Edward's reign was legitimate and secure despite Ethelwald's rebellion. After the monastery was completed, Ealhswith may have lived there herself, at least part of the time. Medieval sources describe her spending her final years in the monastery, though whether she actually became a nun or simply lived there as a wealthy lay resident isn't entirely clear. For royal widows, residing in a monastery was a common and respected choice. It provided them with a safe, honourable place to live, removed from the political intrigues of the court, but still allowing them to maintain their dignity and status. Living at Nunnaminster would have given Ealhswith a peaceful existence after the tumultuous decades of her married life. She would have participated in the daily round of religious services, the multiple prayers and masses that structured monastic life. She would have had her own quarters within the monastery, comfortable and private, with servants to attend to her needs. She would have had the companionship of the nuns, women who shared her commitment to religious life and who would have treated her with great respect as the monastery's founder. But Ealhswith's role wasn't entirely retired and contemplative. With Ethelwald's rebellion crushed and Edward's position as king secure, Ealhswith's status actually increased. During Alfred's lifetime, the West Saxon tradition had prevented her from being called queen or playing a prominent public role. But now her son was king, and that changed things. As the king's mother rather than the king's wife, she could take on a more visible position without violating the taboo against queenship. In 901, just 2 years after Alfred's death, we find the first and only surviving document from Ealhswith's lifetime that includes her as a witness to a charter. The charter was issued by King Edward and involved a grant of land. In the witness list, Ealhswith is identified as Ealhswith Mater Regis, Ealhswith, Mother of the King. Her name appears immediately after King Edward's name and before Edward's wife Aelfled's name. This prominent position indicated that Ealhswith held high status and was considered an important figure in the kingdom. This single charter is frustratingly brief evidence of Ealhswith's activities as Queen Mother, but it suggests that after Alfred's death, she was able to emerge from the shadows and take on a more public role. As Queen Mother, she could attend her son's council meetings, could witness official documents, and could advise him on matters of state, all things that would have been denied to her as Alfred's wife due to West Saxon tradition. The charter that Ealhswith witnessed involved land in Worcestershire, which was in Mercia. This may not be coincidental. Ealhswith was, after all, Mercian by birth, descended from Mercian kings through her mother. Her daughter Ethelfled was now Lady of the Mercians, ruling western Mercia, alongside her husband Ethelred. Ealhswith's appearance in a document dealing with Mercian affairs suggests that she may have been particularly involved in matters relating to her homeland, using her Mercian heritage and connections to help Edward govern Mercia and integrate it more fully into his kingdom. Indeed, Ealhswith's Mercian heritage was one of her most valuable assets to Edward's reign. Edward was working to present himself as king not just of Wessex, but of all the Anglo-Saxons, ruler of both Wessex and Mercia, with ambitions to eventually rule over all of England. Having a mother who was descended from Mercian kings helped legitimize Edward's claims to authority over Mercia. It meant that Edward himself carried Mercian royal blood through his mother, making him not entirely a foreign West Saxon conqueror, but someone with ancestral ties to Mercia's ruling dynasty. Ealhswith's daughter, Ethelfled, was playing an even more prominent role in Mercia. By the early 900s, Ethelfled's husband Ethelred was in declining health, and Ethelfled was effectively ruling Mercia herself. She was leading military campaigns against the Vikings, building fortifications, and governing the kingdom with remarkable skill. She was demonstrating that the daughters of Alfred and Ealhswith were just as capable as their brothers, and she was ensuring that Ealhswith's Mercian heritage would be honoured and remembered. For Ealhswith, watching her daughter rule Mercia must have been a source of immense pride. Ethelfled was doing more than just governing. She was reconquering territories that had been lost to the Vikings, was building new fortified towns to protect against future attacks, and was working alongside her brother Edward to expand their joint control over England. The child who had been born during the Viking Wars and who had survived the ordeal at Athelney was now one of the most powerful and successful rulers in Britain. Ealhswith lived for about 3 years after Alfred's death. The sources don't tell us much about these final years, but we can imagine that they were relatively peaceful compared to the tumultuous decades that had preceded them. The kingdom was secure under Edward's rule. Her children were all established in important positions, and she could look back on a life that had seen extraordinary challenges and extraordinary achievements. Ealhswith died on December 5th, 902, about 3 years after her husband Alfred. She was probably around 50 years old, having lived through some of the most dramatic and dangerous years in English history. She died at Nunnaminster in Winchester, the religious house she had founded, and it seems fitting that her last days were spent in the place she had created as a centre of prayer and learning. According to tradition, Ealhswith was buried in the Old Minster in Winchester, next to her husband Alfred. This was itself significant, as not all royal wives were buried alongside their husbands. The decision to bury Ealhswith with Alfred was a statement about her importance and the enduring nature of their partnership. Even death wouldn't separate them. They would lie side by side through eternity. When Edward completed the new minster a few years later, he had both his parents' bodies moved from the old minster to the new church. Alfred and Ealhswith were reinterred together before the high altar of the new minster, in the place of greatest honour in the new church. This relocation established the new minster as the burial church for the royal dynasty, with Alfred and Ealhswith as its founding ancestors. For over 2 centuries, the new minster would serve as the primary burial place for the West Saxon royal family. The new minster remained an important religious and royal centre until after the Norman conquest. In 1110, over 200 years after Ealhswith's death, the monks of the new minster moved to a new location at Hyde, about a mile north of Winchester. They took with them the bodies of Alfred, Ealhswith, and the other royal dead who had been buried in the new minster. Hyde Abbey became their final resting place, where they would remain until the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in 1539. When Hyde Abbey was dissolved, the tombs of Alfred and Ealhswith were destroyed, and their remains were scattered or lost. In the 1780s, when a prison was being built on the site of Hyde Abbey, workers reportedly found stone coffins that might have contained royal remains, but these were broken up and the bones scattered. Various attempts over the centuries to locate and identify remains that might belong to Alfred or Ealhswith have been largely unsuccessful. The loss of Ealhswith's physical remains doesn't diminish her importance or her legacy. What matters is what she accomplished during her lifetime and how she helped shape English history during one of its most critical periods. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, let us consider the remarkable legacy that Ealhswith left behind, a legacy that echoes through the centuries and that shaped the course of English history in ways both visible and hidden. Ealhswith's most obvious legacy lies in her children and their descendants. Through her son Edward the Elder, she is an ancestor of every subsequent English monarch. Edward continued his father's work, expanding West Saxon control until he ruled most of what is now England. His son Aethelstan would become the first king to truly rule all of England, finally uniting the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under one crown. And from that line would come all the kings and queens of England, down to the present day. Even the Norman conquest of 1066 didn't break this ancestral line. When William the Conqueror defeated Harold Godwinson and seized the English throne, he married Matilda of Flanders, who was Ealhswith's descendant through her daughter Ealhswith. This meant that even after the Norman conquest, even after the Anglo-Saxon royal line was overthrown militarily, Ealhswith's bloodline continued to rule England. Every English monarch since William the Conqueror, including the current British royal family, is descended from Ealhswith. Through her daughter Ethelflaed, Ealhswith's legacy is even more direct and remarkable. Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, became one of the most successful military commanders of her age. She built fortifications throughout Mercia, captured Viking strongholds including the strategically vital town of Derby, received the submission of Leicester, and was negotiating the surrender of York, which would have given her control over all of northern England. When she died in 918, Ethelflaed demonstrated that women could be effective military and political leaders, and she remains an inspiration to historians and to people interested in women's history. Ealhswith's founding of Nunnaminster had a lasting impact that extended for over 600 years. The monastery she established became one of the most important religious houses in southern England, serving as a centre of learning and piety for generations of nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and scholarship. The monastery was repeatedly rebuilt and expanded. Bishop Ethelwald rebuilt it in stone in the 960s as part of his monastic reforms, and after the Norman conquest, it was rebuilt again in the grand Romanesque style. At the time of its dissolution in 1539, it supported a community of over 26 nuns plus students, officials and servants. Even after its dissolution, the site of Nunnaminster remained important. Today, the foundations of the abbey can still be seen in Winchester's Abbey Gardens, marked out with different coloured materials to show where the walls once stood. The site has been excavated by archaeologists, revealing details about the buildings and the lives of the people who lived there. An abbey house, which was built on part of the former monastery grounds, still serves as the official residence of the Mayor of Winchester. But perhaps Ealhswith's greatest legacy is less tangible and harder to measure. Her example of resilience, loyalty, and quiet strength during times of crisis. When the Vikings attacked Chippenham and Alfred fled into the marshes, Ealhswith could have abandoned him. She could have taken her children and fled to Mercia, seeking protection from her own family. She could have tried to negotiate with the Vikings, offering to divorce Alfred in exchange for safety. Instead, she stayed with her husband, followed him into exile, endured months of hardship and danger, and maintained faith that somehow they would prevail. That loyalty and courage helped Alfred survive his darkest hour and eventually reconquer his kingdom. Without Ealhswith's support during those terrible months at Athelney, Alfred might not have had the strength to continue, might not have been able to maintain the household and the small core of loyal followers that formed the nucleus of his eventual army. Ealhswith's contribution to Alfred's victory was not in leading armies or fighting battles, but in providing the stability, the encouragement, and the determination that kept Alfred going when everything seemed lost. Ealhswith's story also illustrates the often invisible role of women in medieval history. The fact that she was never called queen, that she rarely appeared in official documents, that chroniclers paid her little attention. None of this means she was unimportant. It just means that the systems of record-keeping in Anglo-Saxon England were designed in ways that made women's contributions less visible. We have to read between the lines to understand Ealhswith's importance. The fact that Alfred married her reveals the significance of the Mercian alliance. The fact that he stayed married to her for 31 years, despite having the power to set her aside if he wished, suggests a genuine partnership. The fact that he left her valuable estates with symbolic significance in his will shows that he valued her role in his life and reign. The fact that she founded Nunnaminster demonstrates her agency and commitment to religious patronage. The fact that she witnessed a charter as Mother of the King after Edward's accession shows that she had status and influence. Looking at Ealhswith's life as a whole, we see a woman who navigated a complex and dangerous world with grace and strength. She was born into Mercian nobility at a time when her homeland was under threat from Viking invasions. She made a strategic marriage that forged an alliance between two kingdoms. She supported her husband through military defeats and victories, through exile and triumph. She raised 5 children who survived to adulthood and who went on to play crucial roles in English history. She founded one of the most important religious houses in southern England, and she lived to see her son securely established as king and her daughter ruling over her ancestral homeland of Mercia. Ealhswith didn't command armies in battle, didn't issue laws, didn't write books that have survived to modern times. But she did something perhaps more important. She helped hold together the family and the kingdom during their darkest hour. She provided stability when everything was falling apart. She raised the children who would create a unified English nation. She used her Mercian heritage to help legitimize her family's rule over all of England. In many ways, Ealhswith represents the countless women throughout history whose contributions were essential but often unrecorded. We don't know what advice she gave her husband, what comfort she provided during difficult times, what influence she had on her children's upbringing, what role she played in the daily administration of the kingdom. But we know she was there, a constant presence through 3 decades of crisis and transformation. The Anglo-Saxon period would continue for over a century and a half after Ealhswith's death. Her son Edward ruled until 924, expanding his control over more of England. Her grandson Athelstan became the first king to rule all of England. But even after the Norman conquest ended Anglo-Saxon rule in 1066, Ealhswith's bloodline continued through the royal family. Every British monarch since then has been her descendant. Today, over 1100 years after Ealhswith's death, her legacy lives on. Every British monarch is her descendant. The Abbey Gardens in Winchester mark the site of the monastery she founded. Historians studying the period of Alfred the Great and the formation of England inevitably encounter her story. And most importantly, the unified English nation that exists today can trace its origins back to the period when Ealhswith and Alfred stood together against the Vikings, refused to surrender, and fought to preserve Anglo-Saxon independence and Christian civilization. So sleep well, dear listener, and remember the Mercian princess who became the Lady of the English, who stood beside Alfred the Great in his darkest hour, who founded monasteries and raised queens and kings, and who left behind a legacy that echoes through the centuries. Remember her courage during the flight from Chippenham, her resilience during the months at Athelney, her wisdom in raising her remarkable children, and her faith that sustained her through decades of crisis. May her story bring you peaceful dreams of quiet strength that changes the world, of loyalty that endures through the darkest times, of wisdom that shapes generations, and of love that builds dynasties. May you rest as peacefully as Ealhswith now rests, her work complete, her legacy secured, her name honored through the ages. Good night, sweet dreamer. Sleep well, and may the spirit of Ealhswith, the Mercian princess who helped save England, watch over your dreams